The wind moves differently here, across these ancient heights. It carries with it something more than the scent of grass and distant rain. It carries time itself, layers of it, centuries folded into the earth beneath your feet. Stand for a moment on the ramparts of this hill, fort, somewhere in the heart of Europe. Perhaps it is Heuneburg, overlooking the upper Danube in southern Germany, where archaeologists have uncovered the remains of mud brick fortifications that once echoed Mediterranean styles. Or perhaps it is Bibracte, in the forests of Burgundy, where the Druid tribe built a city on a mountain, a place of 60,000 souls at its height, now reduced to grass-covered banks and scattered stones. The exact location matters less than the feeling of the place. The way the present thins here becomes transparent, allowing glimpses of what came before. The silence is profound. Few sheep graze among the earthworks. A hiking trail cuts through what was once a formidable gateway. Information boards stand at intervals, their text weathered by seasons, explaining in several languages what used to be here. But the boards cannot convey the full weight of it, the centuries of habitation, the countless lives lived within these walls, the decisions made, the children born, the old laid to rest. They cannot convey the sophistication of the society that built this place, the reach of its trade networks, the complexity of its social structures, the beauty of its art. For most visitors, if they come at all, this is simply a nice walk with a view. The deeper history remains hidden, accessible only to those willing to look beyond the surface, to piece together fragments, to imagine. This is the challenge we face when we speak of the Celtic Iron Age. The word Celt itself has become slippery, loaded with centuries of misunderstanding and romantic invention. To the ancient Greeks and Romans who coined the terms Keltoi and Galli, these words describe the peoples living beyond the Alps, in the forests and river valleys of Central and Western Europe. To medieval scholars rediscovering classical texts, the Celts became mysterious ancestors, noble savages, keepers of ancient wisdom. To modern popular culture, they have become a kind of brand, mystical, tribal, inevitably associated with Druids and standing stones, with a vague spiritual connection to nature that probably owes more to 19th century romanticism than to any historical reality. But beneath all these layers of interpretation, there were real people. People who lived in a world that existed for centuries before Julius Caesar marched his legions across the Rhine and the Channel, before Roman concrete and Latin inscriptions spread across the landscape, before the very concept of Europe as we understand it today. This was a world that stretched from the Atlantic shores of Ireland and Iberia to the Carpathian Mountains and the edges of the Black Sea, a world of hundreds of tribes and kingdoms, each with its own identity, its own dialects and customs, yet connected by networks of trade, shared artistic traditions, and similar social structures. A world that has left us hillfort ramparts and golden torcs, ritual deposits in lakes and rivers, wagon burials filled with imported luxuries, the foundations of settlements that were, by any reasonable definition, cities. The evidence is there, scattered across the landscape, and preserved in museum collections, but it requires effort to see it clearly. Unlike Rome, the Celtic peoples left no written histories of their own, no equivalent of Livy or Tacitus to record their deeds, what writing they had, and they did have writing systems, adapted from Greek and Etruscan models, was used primarily for short inscriptions, labels, and dedications. The Druids, who served as priests and scholars and judges, famously refused to commit their knowledge to writing, preferring to preserve it through rigorous memorization and oral transmission. This was a deliberate choice, not a mark of primitiveness, but it means that the Celtic voice comes to us filtered through the accounts of outsiders, usually Greeks and Romans who had their own agendas, their own cultural prejudices. So we must read the landscape itself. We must learn to interpret the silent testimony of archaeology, the post holes of longhouses, the slag heaps of smithies, the grave goods that speak of status and belief, the careful deposition of objects in watery places. We must understand that a golden torque found in a French river was not simply lost but deliberately given to the gods, that a hill fort enclosing 200 hectares was not merely a refuge but a statement of political power, that the swirling patterns on a bronze mirror or a ceramic pot are not random decoration but a sophisticated artistic language, expressing ideas about identity and cosmos and connection. This is what we have lost, more than anything, not the objects themselves, many of which survive in remarkable condition, but the meanings attached to them. We can analyze the metalwork and marvel at the craftsmanship. We can map the trade routes and document the spread of styles and technologies. We can excavate the ramparts and reconstruct the defenses. But we cannot fully recover the stories people told about these things. The songs sung in the great halls, the prayers offered at sacred springs, the genealogies recited to establish claim to land and authority. We cannot hear the languages as they were spoken, though we can see their descendants still alive in Irish and Welsh and Breton. We cannot witness the ceremonies that marked the turning of the seasons, the installation of kings, the dedication of weapons before battle. What we can do is piece together a picture, incomplete but substantial, of a world that was anything but barbaric. The hill forts themselves testify to this. The construction of places like Maiden Castle in Britain or Entremont in Provence required not only enormous labour, thousands of person-hours moving earth and stone, but also sophisticated engineering knowledge, and perhaps most importantly, the social organisation, to mobilise and coordinate that labour. These were not random collections of huts huddled behind makeshift defences. They were planned communities with designated areas for different activities: residential quarters, craft workshops, storage facilities, spaces for ritual and assembly. The largest of them, the oppida of the late Iron Age, had populations that rivaled contemporary Mediterranean cities. And they were connected, these places, by roads and rivers, by traders and craftspeople who moved between them, by marriage alliances and political federations, by the slow exchange of ideas and innovations. A style of metalworking developed in one region would appear, with local variations hundreds of miles away within a generation. Amber from the Baltic shores wound up in graves in southern France. British tin was essential for bronze production across the continent. Wine amphorae from Italy and Greece had been found in settlements far beyond the Roman frontier. This was not a static, isolated world, but a dynamic one, constantly changing, constantly in contact with its neighbours. Yet, it has been largely forgotten. Ask most people what they know about Europe in 500 BCE, and they will speak of classical Greece, the age of Pericles, the Parthenon, the philosophers and playwrights. Ask about 100 BCE, and they will think of Rome, the late Republic, Caesar and Pompey, the civil wars that would lead to empire. The Celtic Iron Age, if it appears at all, is merely backdrop, the setting against which classical civilization played out its dramas. The Celts are the people being conquered, the barbarians at the gate, the mysterious others, whose defeat was inevitable, whose cultures were destined to be absorbed or erased. But this is a profound distortion. For most of the first millennium BCE, it was the Celtic peoples who dominated much of Europe. It was their innovations in ironworking and agriculture that drove economic growth, their art styles that influenced even the Mediterranean world, their warriors who sacked Rome itself in 387 BCE, an event that traumatized the Roman psyche for centuries, their social structures, client-patron relationships, gift-giving networks, warrior aristocracies that would shape medieval Europe. They were not waiting to be civilized by Rome. They had their own forms of civilization, different from the classical model, but no less valid, no less sophisticated. So we return to the windswept hillfort, to this particular patch of grass and stone and sky. You return with questions. What was this place when it was alive? Who walked these ramparts? What did they see when they looked out over the landscape? Not just hills and forests and rivers, but a human geography of alliance and rivalry, of sacred sites and boundary markers, of roads leading to other settlements and worlds beyond. What did they believe? What did they hope for? What did they fear? The answers are not lost entirely. They are here, waiting, in the earth and the artifacts, in the patterns of trade and settlement, in the survival of languages and stories, in the very shape of the land. We need only learn how to read them. This is the journey we are embarking upon now. Not a journey through battles and kings alone, though there will be some of that, but primarily a journey through the everyday and the profound, through the rhythms of agricultural life and the spectacle of royal burials, through the work of the smith and the craft of the Druid, through the evidence of trade networks and the mystery of sacred groves. We will walk through oppida at their height, bustling with activity, and stand beside the graves of warriors and priestesses. We will trace the flow of amber and bronze and wine across Europe. We will try to understand what it meant to be Celtic, what united these diverse peoples, what made their world distinct. And we will do this slowly, carefully, letting the details accumulate, letting the picture emerge gradually from the mist. Because this is not a story of dramatic events and sudden changes, though those occurred. It is a story of centuries, of the long arc of cultural development and transformation. It is a story best told at the pace of the seasons, of the gradual clearing of forests and the slow filling of graveyards, of traditions passed from one generation to the next over lifetimes. It is a story written in the landscape itself, and to read it, we must learn to slow down, to notice, to dwell. The sun is lower now, The shadows of the earthwork banks stretch across the interior of the hill fort. In a few hours, darkness will come, and the place will belong entirely to the wind and the stars, as it has for most of its long existence. But for now, we stand here at the threshold, ready to step back into that forgotten world, to see it as clearly as the fragmentary evidence allows, to honor it by trying to understand. The Celts ruled Europe once. Before Rome, before the names on modern maps, before the borders and nations we know today, they shaped this continent, left their mark on its soil and stone and water. Their world is worth recovering, worth remembering, worth the effort of careful reconstruction. So let us begin. To understand the Celtic peoples, we must first understand the land they inhabited. Geography is not merely backdrop in human history. It shapes everything, from patterns of settlement to forms of social organization, from what people eat to whom they trade with, from their mythology to their sense of identity. The Celtic world, at its greatest extent in the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE, encompassed an extraordinary diversity of landscapes, each with its own character, its own challenges, its own possibilities. Yet certain features recur across this vast territory, certain patterns emerge that help explain the remarkable coherence of Celtic culture, despite its geographical dispersion. Begin with the rivers. If you were to map the heartlands of Celtic Europe, you would be mapping river systems above all else. The great waterways that flow from the highlands of Central Europe, toward every sea, the Danube running east toward the Black Sea, the Rhine flowing north to the cold waters where it meets the ocean, the Seine and the Loire winding westward through what would become France, the Thames and the Severn in Britain, the Tagus and the Ebro in Iberia. These were the highways of the ancient world, far more important than any road, easier to travel than dense forest or mountain pass. Rivers provided transport for goods and people. They provided water for crops and animals. They provided fish and reeds for thatching and clay for pottery. And they provided something less tangible but equally important. They provided boundaries and connections, natural dividing lines between territories, but also routes for contact and exchange. The Danube in particular seems to have been central to the development of Celtic culture. The upper and middle Danube Valley, from the headwaters in the Black Forest to the Great Bend in what is now Hungary, was the heartland of the Hallstatt culture, named after a site in Austria where a salt mine and an associated cemetery have yielded some of the richest Iron Age burials in Europe. Here, between roughly 800 and 450 BCE, distinctive artistic styles emerged, sophisticated social hierarchies developed, and control of crucial resources, salt, iron, copper, created wealth that would fund elaborate displays of status. The river connected this region to worlds beyond, downstream to the steppe peoples of the east, upstream to the Alpine passes that led to Italy and the Mediterranean. When we speak of Celtic Europe, we are speaking in large part about communities oriented toward these river valleys, drawing sustenance from them, using them to project power and influence. But rivers were not the only defining features. The forests were equally important, and in some ways more characteristic of the Celtic world as outsiders perceived it. To Greek and Roman writers, accustomed to the cleared agricultural landscapes of the Mediterranean, the forests beyond the Alps seemed endless, dark, mysterious. Strabo writes of the Hercynian forest, which he claims took 60 days to traverse, stretching from the Rhine deep into Germania and beyond. Caesar describes the forests of Gaul and Britain in similar terms: dense, trackless, dangerous, home to wild boar and wolves, to ambushes and guerrilla warfare. The forest in classical imagination became synonymous with barbarism, the opposite of civilization, which was defined by cities and cultivated fields and olive groves. But this is a distortion. The Celts were not forest nomads. They were farmers, settled in the river valleys and on the edges of cleared land. Yet the forest was indeed central to their world, not as a place of permanent habitation, but as a resource and a presence. Forests provided timber for building. The round houses and rectangular halls of Celtic settlements were timber framed. The great ramparts of hill forts faced with wooden beams. Forests provided fuel for the fires of home and smithy. They provided acorns for pig herding, one of the fundamental economic activities of Celtic Europe. They provided game for hunting and spaces for grazing during summer months. And they provided, perhaps most importantly, a sense of the sacred. Sacred groves appear repeatedly in the fragmentary evidence of Celtic religion, places where the boundary between human and divine, between the known and the unknown, grew thin. Walk through what remains of these forests today, and you will find they have a different quality from the tamed landscapes around them. In the beech forests of southern Germany, or the oak woods of Britain and Ireland, there is a stillness, a particular quality of light filtering through leaves, a sense of enclosure, and yet also of depth, of spaces receding beyond sight. It is not hard to imagine these places as sacred, marked by wooden posts or stones, by offerings left at the base of ancient trees. The forest was not chaos to the Celts, it was part of their ordered world, a place with its own rules and inhabitants, both physical and spiritual. Between the rivers and the forests, the hills, Celtic Europe was not flat. Even the great river valleys were bounded by uplands. The Jura and the Alps, the central massif of France, the Vosges and the Black Forest, the Cévennes and the Pyrenees, the Pennines and the Scottish Highlands. These hills and mountains provided natural boundaries between tribal territories, but they also provided resources. The hills were rich in minerals: iron, copper, tin, gold, silver, salt. Control of these resources was a foundation of power. The Hallstatt culture's wealth came in large part from salt mining. The tin of Cornwall and Brittany was essential for bronze production across Europe. The gold of Transylvania and Ireland was worked into the spectacular torcs and ornaments that marked high status. And the hills provided something else: defensibility. This is why the hillfort became such a characteristic feature of Celtic Europe. A settlement on a hilltop, surrounded by ramparts of earth and stone, could be held by a relatively small force against a much larger attacking army. The effort required to storm such a place was immense. Attackers had to climb steep slopes under a rain of missiles from above, then breach walls that might be 10 or 15 feet high and equally thick. Many hill forts were never attacked. Their strength alone was deterrent enough, a statement of power that made conflict unnecessary. But they were real fortifications nonetheless, not symbolic, and the evidence of burning and destruction at some sites reminds us that the Iron Age was not a peaceful time. The topography of Celtic Europe, then, was a complex mosaic: river valleys, where settlement concentrated, forests that provided resources and sacred spaces, hills that offered minerals and defense. But we must add to this the coasts, the long Atlantic seaboard from Galicia to Scotland, the Mediterranean shores of southern Gaul and Iberia, the North Sea and Baltic coasts. The sea was not a barrier to the Celts any more than rivers were. They were accomplished sailors and traders. Tin from Cornwall reached the Mediterranean by sea routes, likely island hopping along the Atlantic coast before entering the Straits of Gibraltar. The Irish Sea was a highway, connecting Ireland, Wales and western Scotland, fostering cultural exchange, and probably also raiding and migration. Even the North Sea and the Channel were crossed regularly. Caesar notes the Veneti of Brittany had ships superior to his own Roman vessels, better adapted to the strong tides and storms of Atlantic waters. So the Celtic world was not landlocked or isolated. It was part of a wider web of exchange that connected the Atlantic to the Mediterranean, the North Sea to the Black Sea. Goods moved along these routes: metals, amber, salt, wine, grain, slaves, fine metalwork, and with them, ideas and styles and technologies. A Greek merchant traveling up the Rhone Valley to trade with the Aedui could bring not just wine, but knowledge of Mediterranean art and architecture. A British trader bringing tin to Armorica might return with new forms of pottery or jewelry. The Celtic world was permeable, constantly absorbing influences from outside, while maintaining its own distinct character. And what of the climate, the seasons, the daily rhythms of weather and light? This is harder to recover, but essential to understanding. The first millennium BCE was not dramatically different from today in terms of overall climate, though there were fluctuations, periods slightly warmer or colder, wetter or drier. Generally, the climate was temperate, with cold winters and mild summers, ample rainfall supporting agriculture. This was not the Mediterranean world of hot, dry summers and mild, wet winters. The Celtic year was structured around different rhythms: the cycle of planting and harvest in spring and autumn, the long winter when outdoor work was limited, when people and animals stayed close to home, when the stores laid up in previous months meant the difference between survival and starvation. The Celtic calendar, as far as we can reconstruct it, was lunar rather than solar, divided into a dark half and a light half of the year. The Festival of Samhain marked the beginning of winter, a time when the boundary between the living and the dead was thought to be thinnest. Imbolc, in early spring, celebrated the first stirrings of new life. Beltane in May marked the beginning of summer, the time when cattle were driven to upland pastures. Lugnasad in August was the harvest festival, a time of plenty and celebration before the return of the dark months. These festivals were not arbitrary. They were tied to the practical realities of pastoral and agricultural life, to the movements of animals and the growth of crops. But they were also moments of religious significance, times when the community gathered, when rituals were performed, when the bonds between people and land and gods were renewed. Living in this landscape required intimate knowledge. You needed to know where the good fishing was, which streams ran clearest, where the clay was best for pottery, which slopes faced south and warmed earliest in spring. You needed to know the grazing patterns of wild game, the migration routes of birds, the places where useful plants grew, willows for basketry, nettles for fiber and food, mushrooms and berries and medicinal herbs. You needed to know the calendar of tasks, when to plow, when to sow, when to harvest hay, when to slaughter animals for winter stores, when to shear sheep, when to gather firewood. This knowledge was passed down through generations, encoded in custom and practice, in the advice of elders, in the stories told on winter nights. And you needed to know the human geography as well. Which neighboring settlement was allied, which was rival, where the boundaries of your tribe's territory lay, which routes were safe to travel, and which were dangerous. The landscape was not empty or neutral. Every hill and stream and grove had names, many of which have survived in place names to this day. Many had stories attached to them. This was where a great battle was fought. That spring was sacred to a particular goddess. This ford was haunted. That hill was the burial place of an ancient king. The land was thick with meaning, layered with centuries of human experience and interpretation. We tend to think of the Iron Age as remote, alien, difficult to access. And in some ways it is. We cannot know what it felt like to live without electricity or antibiotics, without books or recorded music, without all the technologies we take for granted. But in other ways, the Iron Age landscape is still with us. The rivers follow the same courses. The hills have the same shapes. The forests, though much reduced, grow on the same soils. The seasons turn in the same sequence. Stand in a river valley in France or Germany or Britain, away from modern development, and you are looking at essentially the same landscape that Celtic farmers and herders knew. The view has not changed as much as we might think. What has changed is the human presence, the settlements, the fields, the paths, the monuments. But these too have left traces, visible to those who know how to look. This, then, was the stage on which Celtic life unfolded. A world of rivers and forests and hills, of temperate climate and seasonal rhythms, of resources that could support large populations if properly managed, of natural routes that connected distant regions. A world that was generous in some ways, good soil, ample water, rich mineral deposits, but also demanding, requiring hard work and careful planning and intimate knowledge to yield its benefits. A world that shaped the people who lived in it, gave rise to particular forms of social organization and economy, particular patterns of settlement and exchange. To understand the Celts, we must understand this land, must imagine it as it was when the forests were deeper and the rivers wilder, when the hill forts stood new and strong, when the smoke of 1,000 hearths rose into the evening sky. There is a particular quality to standing within the ramparts of an ancient hill fort. The modern world falls away. The distant hum of traffic, the contrails of airplanes, the pull of schedules and devices. What remains is the immediate physical reality of the place. The massive banks of earth and stone rising on all sides. The views opening out through gateways toward the surrounding landscape. The sense of enclosure and protection. The sheer scale of human effort frozen in the ground beneath your feet. These places are among the most visible and dramatic monuments of the Celtic Iron Age. Hundreds of them survive across Europe, from the Scottish Highlands to the Iberian Peninsula, from western France to the Carpathians. Some are small, enclosing just an acre or two. Others are vast, their ramparts running for miles, enclosing areas that could hold thousands of people. Together, they represent one of the most sustained programs of monumental construction in European prehistory. The hill forts were not all built at once, nor for exactly the same purposes. They emerged over centuries, evolving in form and function as Celtic societies themselves evolved. The earliest examples date from the late Bronze Age, simple circuits of earth and timber on hilltops, possibly serving as seasonal refuges or gathering places. But it was during the Iron Age proper, from roughly 800 BCE onward, that hill fort construction intensified and the forms we recognize today became standard. By the late Iron Age, in the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE, some hill forts had grown into oppida, fortified towns with permanent populations in the thousands, with organized street plans, with evidence of craft specialization and trade, with all the characteristics of urban settlements. Why hilltops? The defensive advantages are obvious. A position on high ground gives defenders the advantage of both sight and weaponry. Attackers must climb slopes while under fire from slings and javelins. The effort required to assault such a position was enormous. The casualties likely to be heavy even if the attack succeeded. But defense alone does not explain the hill fort. Many of these sites show no evidence of warfare, no burning layers, no hastily buried hoards of valuables. Some were inhabited for centuries without interruption. The defenses were certainly real, certainly functional if needed, but they were also symbolic statements of power and permanence, visible for miles around, marking the landscape with human authority. Consider Maiden Castle in Dorset, England. It is one of the most impressive hill forts in Europe. Its multiple lines of ramparts and ditches, creating a labyrinthine approach to the interior. The effort required to build it is staggering. Archaeologists have estimated that the final phase of construction, in the 1st century BCE, involved moving hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of chalk rubble, requiring tens of thousands of person-hours of labor. This was not the work of a few families, or even a single village. This required the coordination of a large population, probably the mobilization of labor, from settlements across a wide territory. Someone had the authority to command that labor, to organize and provision workers, to direct the construction according to a plan. That someone was exercising political power on a scale that implies complex social hierarchy and probably some form of centralized leadership. The ramparts themselves were sophisticated constructions. The simplest form was a dump rampart, earth and stone piled into a bank, faced with turf or clay. But many hill forts used more elaborate techniques. The Kelheim style, named after a site in Bavaria, used a framework of horizontal and vertical timbers nailed together. The spaces filled with earth and stone, creating a wall that was both strong and flexible, able to absorb the impact of projectiles without collapsing. The Murus Gallicus, described by Caesar in his accounts of the Gallic Wars, was even more complex, long iron nails securing horizontal timbers that ran the length of the wall, creating a structure that was extraordinarily difficult to breach or burn. Archaeologists have found evidence of these construction techniques at sites across Europe, testimony to a shared engineering knowledge, to craftspeople who understood principles of stress and load-bearing, who could adapt their techniques to local materials and conditions. The gateways were the most vulnerable points, but also the most elaborate. A typical hill fort gateway might be flanked by raised platforms where defenders could rain missiles down on attackers. The passage itself might be bent or angled to slow attackers and expose their unshielded right sides. Some gates had bridges or towers above them. The entrance to Danebury in Hampshire, excavated extensively in the 1970s and 80s, shows multiple rebuildings over 5 centuries, each time becoming more complex and formidable. And the gates were also ritual spaces, places where objects were deliberately deposited. Human and animal skulls, pots, metalwork, suggesting that passage through the gate was not merely a practical act, but a symbolic one, a crossing from outside to inside, from wild to civilized, from profane to sacred. Inside the ramparts, the organization of space varied. Smaller hill forts might have been used only seasonally, occupied during times of threat or during certain festivals, with the daily life of the community taking place in undefended farmsteads in the valleys below. Larger hill forts show evidence of permanent occupation. Post holes from roundhouses, arranged in clusters, perhaps family compounds, storage pits for grain dug deep into the chalk or clay, middens where household waste accumulated, hearths and ovens, wells or cisterns for water supply. At Danebury, excavators found over 2,000 storage pits, many of them 6 to 10 feet deep, a testament to the agricultural surplus being generated and stored here. But hill forts were more than just defended villages. They were centers of production and exchange. At site after site, archaeologists find evidence of craft specialization. The slag from iron smelting, the crucibles and molds for bronze casting, the hauls and loom weights of textile production, the querns for grinding grain. The hill forts were not self-sufficient in the modern sense. They were nodes in networks of exchange, places where raw materials were transformed into finished goods, where goods from distant places were received and redistributed. The spindle hauls and loom weights suggest textile production at a scale beyond household needs, production for trade. The metalworking debris suggests smiths who served not just the hill fort population, but clients from surrounding areas, producing the weapons and tools and ornaments that marked status and identity. And the hill forts were religious centers. Every excavated hill fort of any size has yielded evidence of ritual activity. Pits filled with unusual deposits, boundaries marked by placed objects, areas that seem to have been set aside as shrines or sacred spaces. At some sites, 4-post structures have been found, their posts set in square arrangements, sometimes with burials or offerings at their bases. The interpretation of these is debated. but they seem to have had religious significance. At others, rectangular wooden buildings that may have been temples or shrines. The Celts, as we will explore in more detail later, did not build stone temples in the Mediterranean fashion, but they certainly had sacred spaces, and the hill forts encompass some of them. The social implications of all this are profound. The hill forts were not egalitarian communities. The ability to mobilize labor for rampart construction, the control of craft production, the accumulation of goods for trade, all of this implies hierarchy, implies leaders with authority and resources. Within the hill forts, some roundhouses are larger than others, some located in more prominent positions, some associated with finer objects. These were probably the homes of elites, the chiefs and their families, the warrior aristocracy, perhaps religious specialists. The smaller houses, the more cramped quarters, would have been for dependents, farmers, craftspeople, servants, perhaps unfree laborers or slaves. We can imagine the daily life of a hill fort at its height. The smoke rising from cooking fires, from the smithy's forge, the sounds of children playing, of animals, cattle, sheep, pigs, chickens, kept within the walls or in enclosures just outside. The smell of bread baking, of leather being worked, of dung and hay and humanity in close quarters. In the morning, people heading out through the gates, to work in the fields below, to check on animals in distant pastures, to gather firewood or clay or other resources. In the evening, returning, the gates closing at dusk, a sense of security within the ramparts. On special occasions, festivals, assemblies, royal visits, the population swelling as people came from the surrounding countryside. The hill fort, becoming a theatre for ritual and display, for feasting and gift-giving, for the renewal of social bonds and political alliances. The feasting is important. Classical writers often commented on Celtic feasting practices, usually with a mixture of fascination and disdain. They described enormous consumption of food and drink, boasting and competitive displays, sometimes violence erupting from wounded pride. But feasting was not mere gluttony. It was a central social mechanism, a way of creating and maintaining relationships, of displaying wealth and generosity, of binding warriors to leaders through the reciprocal obligations of gift and service. The great halls we will discuss shortly were built for this purpose. So were the massive quantities of animal bones found in hill fort deposits, the remains of feasts where whole cattle or pigs were roasted, where the community came together to share food and drink, to celebrate success or mourn loss, to reinforce the social order through ritual consumption. As the Iron Age progressed, some hill forts grew into something more. In the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE, across temperate Europe, a new form of settlement emerged. The oppidum, the Latin word used by Caesar, means simply fortified town, but archaeologists have adopted it to describe a specific phenomenon. Very large defended settlements, often enclosing hundreds of hectares, with populations that must have numbered in the thousands, with evidence of planning and organization that marks them as true urban centers. Not all hill forts became oppida. Many were abandoned as populations concentrated in these emerging towns. But the oppida represent the culmination of a long process of social and political centralization, the emergence of something that looks very much like early state formation. The oppida we will examine in detail shortly, but even the smaller hill forts, the ones that never grew into towns, were monuments to human ambition and organization. They marked a landscape, made claims to territory, embodied political authority. They were where deals were made, disputes settled, alliances formed. They were where craftspeople worked under the patronage of the powerful. They were where rituals were performed, where the gods were honored, where the community affirmed its identity. And they were where defenses could be mounted if necessary, where the tribe could gather in times of crisis, where the ramparts stood as both practical protection and symbolic statement. This land is ours. We are strong. We will endure. Standing within those ramparts today, it is easy to feel the weight of that statement. The grass-covered banks may look natural, softened by time, but they are not. They are human constructions. As much as any cathedral or castle, they represent choices made, labor expended, power exercised. They are, in their way, as eloquent as any written document, as revealing as any historical chronicle. They tell us that the Celtic Iron Age was not a time of chaos and barbarism, not a primitive prelude to Roman civilization. It was a time when sophisticated societies organized labor on a massive scale, when engineering knowledge was applied to monumental projects, when settlements were not just defended, but designed. The hill forts are the most visible proof of this. They endure because they were built to endure, because their builders thought in terms of generations, not just seasons. and they endure as challenges to our modern assumptions, reminders that power and sophistication take many forms, not all of them written in stone or recorded in texts. Sometimes they are written in earth, in the shape of the land itself, waiting for those with patience to read them. Classical writers, when they attempted to describe Celtic societies, often struggled with categories. Were the Celts ruled by kings or by councils? Were they democratic or aristocratic? Were they unified or fragmented? The answer, as with most complex questions about the past, is that it depends on which people, which period, which specific community. Celtic Europe was not monolithic. There were hundreds of tribes, each with its own internal structure, its own traditions of leadership, its own relationships with neighbors. Yet certain patterns recur across this diversity. Certain social structures appear again and again, suggesting a shared cultural framework, even where specific implementations varied. At the top of most Celtic societies, we find some form of hereditary elite. The words used vary: kings, chieftains, nobles, aristocrats. But the underlying reality is consistent. A small group of families controlled most of the wealth, monopolized political authority, commanded the loyalty of warriors, and claimed descent from gods or legendary heroes. This was not unusual in the ancient world. Most societies were hierarchical. What is interesting about the Celtic case is how this hierarchy was maintained and justified, how power was exercised, how it could be challenged or lost. Kingship among the Celts was not absolute in the way we might think of later medieval monarchies or Roman emperors. A king's power derived from his ability to attract and retain followers. This was done through generosity, through feasting, through gift-giving, through leading warriors to victory and sharing the spoils. The bond between king and warrior was personal, based on mutual obligation. The king provided protection, hospitality, gifts, weapons, horses, ornaments, land. The warrior provided service, military support, loyalty, prestige. But this was not a one-way relationship. A king who failed to be generous, who lost battles, who could not protect his people, could lose his authority. Warriors might abandon him for a more successful leader. Rivals within the elite might challenge him. In extreme cases, he might be deposed or killed. We see evidence of this in the classical sources. Caesar describes how leadership among the Gauls sometimes shifted from kings to magistrates elected annually. Not democracy in any modern sense, but a system where elite families competed for temporary authority rather than claiming permanent royal status. Tacitus, writing about the Germans who shared many cultural features with the Celts, notes that kings were chosen for their noble birth, but military commanders for their courage, implying different spheres of authority. And the Irish texts, though written down much later, preserve traditions of ritual requirements for kingship. The king must be physically perfect, must perform certain ceremonies, must embody qualities like justice and generosity, or his reign would bring disaster on his people. Below the king or chieftain, a warrior aristocracy. These were the men, and they were almost certainly men in this role, though women could hold high status in other ways, who formed the retinues described in classical accounts and Celtic mythology. They were professional fighters, though that does not mean they did nothing else. They probably also managed estates, judged disputes, led rituals, but their primary identity was martial. They trained from youth in the use of weapons, swords, spears, shields, javelins. They rode horses or drove chariots. They competed with each other in displays of prowess and bravery, and they formed the core of any military force a tribe could field. The equipment of these warriors is well attested archaeologically. The Celtic sword, the long iron blade with its distinctive pointed or rounded tip, is one of the most recognizable artifacts of the Iron Age. These swords were not cheap or simple. Producing one required skill and resources: iron ore, fuel for the forge, a smith who understood the complex process of smelting and forging and quenching. A good sword might take days or weeks to make. It would be valuable, a prestige object as much as a weapon. Many swords show evidence of careful maintenance, of repeated sharpening and repair, and many were eventually deposited in water, rivers, lakes, bogs, as offerings, suggesting they had ritual significance beyond mere utility. Shields too were both functional and symbolic. Celtic shields were typically oval or rectangular, made of wood with a metal boss at the center, often decorated with elaborate patterns. The Battersea Shield, found in the Thames and now in the British Museum, is a masterpiece of Latin art. Its surface covered with swirling designs inlaid with red enamel. This was not a battlefield weapon, but a parade shield, an object designed to impress, to display wealth and taste. Yet even everyday shields were carefully made, painted or carved, marked with symbols of identity. The warrior's appearance was important. Classical sources often comment on Celtic warriors' attention to personal adornment. Gold torcs around their necks, bracelets on their arms, brooches fastening their cloaks, their hair washed in lime water to stiffen it into spikes or swept back dramatically. This was not vanity in the trivial sense. It was about identity, about projecting an image of power and fearlessness. A warrior who went into battle wanted to be seen, wanted to be recognized, wanted his enemies to know whom they faced. In a society where reputation was everything, where stories of heroic deeds would be told and retold, appearance mattered. This was not vanity in the trivial sense. Combat itself, as far as we can reconstruct it, was both ritualized and chaotic. Before battles there might be challenges, individual warriors from each side stepping forward to fight single combats while the armies watched. There might be boasting, warriors reciting their ancestry and past victories, mocking their opponents. Then the clash, the press of bodies and shields, the terrifying noise, the confusion. The goal was not to kill every enemy, but to break their formation, to make them run. A routed army could be pursued and slaughtered. An army that held its ground was respected, might negotiate terms, might withdraw with honor intact. But war was not constant. Most of the time, most communities were not fighting. War was a seasonal activity, conducted in summer, when movement was easier and when men could be spared from agricultural work. And much of it was probably raiding rather than pitched battle, small groups crossing into neighboring territory to steal cattle, to take captives, to demonstrate prowess and bring back plunder. This kind of low-intensity warfare was endemic in many pre-state societies. It was dangerous, sometimes deadly, but it served social functions, redistributing wealth, providing opportunities for young men to prove themselves, maintaining social bonds within the raiding party. Beyond the warrior elite, the broader population, farmers made up the majority, as they did in every pre-industrial society. They worked the land, raised animals, produced the food surplus that supported everyone else. Their lives were hard, shaped by the rhythms of the agricultural year, by the demands of their lords, by the vulnerability to crop failure or disease. We know less about them than about the elites, because they left fewer traces in the archaeological record. They did not have rich burials with elaborate grave goods. They did not live in the prominent houses at the centers of hillforts, but they were essential, the foundation on which everything else rested. And there were specialists, smiths, potters, weavers, carpenters, all the craftspeople whose skills were necessary for a functioning society. Some of these probably worked full-time at their trades, supported by the patronage of the elite, or by payment in kind from the community. Others probably combined craft work with farming, making pots or weaving cloth in the off-season. The status of craftspeople varied. A skilled smith, capable of producing fine metalwork, might have high status, might be associated with ritual knowledge. Smithing was, after all, a kind of magic, transforming raw ore into useful objects through the mysterious agency of fire. Other craftspeople were probably less prestigious, but still valued for their skills. And there was unfree labor. The classical sources mention slavery among the Celts, and there is no reason to doubt this. Captives taken in war could be enslaved. People in debt might become dependent laborers. Children might be born into unfree status. The scale and nature of slavery in Celtic Europe is debated, but it certainly existed. Some slaves were probably traded. We know that slaves were among the goods moving along long-distance trade routes. Others probably worked on the estates of the elite, in the fields or in domestic service. And there were the Druids. They deserve their own discussion, which we will have shortly, but they must be mentioned here, because they were part of the social hierarchy, a group apart with their own sources of authority. The Druids were religious specialists, but also much more: teachers, judges, advisors to kings, keepers of tradition and law. They wielded no weapons, commanded no warbands, yet their power was real. A Druid's curse was feared. A Druid's judgment in a legal dispute was binding. A Druid's knowledge of ritual and calendar was necessary for the proper functioning of society. They stood outside the normal hierarchy of king and warrior and farmer, yet they were essential to it. What held this complex social structure together? Partly coercion, the ability of the elite to command labor, to demand tribute, to punish those who refused. But coercion alone is never enough. There must also be consent, or at least acquiescence, some sense that the social order is legitimate, that the elite have the right to rule. This legitimacy came from multiple sources. Ancestry was one. Celtic elites claimed descent from gods or legendary heroes. These genealogies were carefully maintained, recited on important occasions, used to justify claims to land and authority. If your ancestors had ruled this territory for generations, if they were sons of gods, then your right to rule was not arbitrary, but divinely ordained, woven into the fabric of the cosmos. Generosity was another. A good lord was generous. He feasted his followers. He gave gifts. He shared the spoils of war. This was not altruism. It was investment, creating networks of obligation and loyalty. But it was also expected, part of what defined good leadership. A lord who hoarded wealth, who failed to share, would lose respect and followers. Military success mattered. A leader who won battles, who brought back plunder, who protected his people from enemies, demonstrated his fitness to rule. Defeat could be forgiven if it was honorable, if the leader fought bravely even in loss. But consistent failure, especially if it seemed to stem from cowardice or incompetence, could be fatal to a leader's authority. And ritual played a role. The king or chief was not just a political and military leader, but a ritual figure, responsible for maintaining right relationships with the gods, for ensuring the fertility of the land and the prosperity of the people. The Irish sources speak of the king's relationship with the sovereignty goddess, a symbolic marriage that ensured the well-being of the kingdom. While we must be cautious about applying later Irish concepts to earlier continental societies, the idea that leadership had a sacred dimension seems well attested. This was the structure of Celtic society. Then, hierarchical but not rigid, with elite authority balanced by expectations of generosity and success, with specialists and priests occupying their own niches, with the majority farming and herding and supporting the whole edifice. It was a structure that could be stable over generations, dynasties ruling the same territories for centuries, but it could also be unstable, vulnerable to succession disputes, to ambitious rivals, to external shocks. When Rome came, offering both threats and opportunities, many of these kingdoms would fracture, some elites collaborating with the conquerors, others leading resistance, most trying to navigate between these extremes and preserve what power they could. But before that, for centuries, this social order had functioned, had organized labor and distributed resources, had waged wars and made peace, had created the monuments and artifacts and traditions that still define the Celtic Iron Age. There is a moment in many museums, walking through galleries of ancient artifacts, when something stops you, not because it is large or obviously impressive, but because of its beauty, its strangeness, the way it seems to speak across millennia, in a language that is almost comprehensible but not quite. For the Celtic Iron Age, this moment often comes in front of a display of metalwork, a golden torque twisted from thick strands of metal, terminals shaped into elaborate knots or animal heads, a bronze mirror, its back surface covered with flowing curves and spirals that seem to have no beginning or end, a sword hilt decorated with coral and enamel, a sheet of bronze worked into the form of a shield, its surface alive with abstract patterns that draw the eye inward, deeper, following lines that connect and diverge and connect again. This is Latin art, named after a site on the shores of Lake Neuchâtel, in Switzerland, where hundreds of objects were recovered from what appears to have been a ritual deposit. It is one of the most distinctive artistic traditions of the ancient world, instantly recognizable, yet endlessly various, appearing across Celtic Europe from the 5th century BCE onward, evolving through centuries, adapting to local preferences and new influences, but maintaining a fundamental aesthetic consistency. It is abstract rather than representational, preferring curves to straight lines, asymmetry to rigid balance, ambiguity to clarity. It incorporates motifs from the natural world, animals, plants, human faces, but transforms them, makes them part of larger patterns, refuses to let them simply be what they are. To understand this art, we must understand its context. These objects were not made for display in museums. They were made to be used, worn, carried, given as gifts, eventually deposited as offerings. They were markers of identity and status. A warrior wearing a golden torque announced his wealth and lineage. A woman fastening her cloak with an elaborate brooch displayed her family's resources and connections. A chief giving a finely decorated sword to a follower was not just arming him but binding him through the web of obligation that gift-giving created. And when these objects were finally thrown into rivers, or buried in graves, or hidden in hoards, they were carrying messages to the gods, to the ancestors, to the future. The technical skill required to produce this metalwork was extraordinary. Consider the process of making a torque, not a simple twisted band, but one of the elaborate examples like those found at Snettisham in England or Erstfeld in Switzerland. The smith begins with gold, either mined locally or acquired through trade, probably in the form of nuggets or rings or broken older jewelry. This gold must be refined, melted, cast into a workable form. Then comes the shaping, the gold drawn into thick wires or rods, twisted together with precise control to create the spiral pattern. The ends work separately to form the terminals, those elaborate three-dimensional sculptures in miniature. Finally, surface decoration, engraving, punching, the addition of granulation or filigree. The whole process might take weeks, requiring not just manual skill but deep knowledge of materials, of how gold behaves when heated and worked, of how to achieve the desired effects without cracking or distorting the metal. Bronze working was equally demanding. Bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, was harder than gold, more suitable for functional objects, like mirrors, vessels, horse harness fittings, but it required its own expertise. The smith had to know the correct proportions of copper and tin for different purposes, had to understand casting techniques, how to create molds, how to achieve fine detail, and then came the decoration. Many bronze objects were engraved after casting, the smith using sharp tools to cut patterns into the surface. Others were decorated with enamel, colored glass fused into recessed areas, creating brilliant contrasts of red or blue against the gold and bronze. Iron, paradoxically, was both more common and more challenging. Iron ore was widespread across Europe, far more abundant than copper or tin. But iron requires higher temperatures to smelt and forge, and the resulting metal is harder to work, less predictable. The Celtic smiths mastered iron, produced weapons and tools that were functional and durable. But iron was rarely decorated as elaborately as bronze or gold. It was too hard to engrave, too prone to corrosion. Iron's value was utilitarian, though a well-made iron sword was still a prestige object, still carried symbolic weight beyond its function. The patterns themselves deserve close attention. The flowing curves, the spirals and tendrils, the waveforms seem to metamorphose as you follow them. This is not random decoration. There are conventions, rules, though they are not rigid. Certain motifs recur. The triscale, a three-armed spiral. The lyre palmette, a stylized plant form borrowed from Greek art, but transformed into something distinctly Celtic. Animal forms, especially birds and horses and boars, but rendered in curving lines that emphasize movement and fluidity, rather than anatomical accuracy. Human faces that emerge from patterns sometimes obvious, sometimes hidden, requiring a shift of perception to see them. Some scholars have argued that this art is narrative, that the patterns tell stories now lost to us. Others see it as purely decorative, as display of skill and wealth, without deeper meaning. A third interpretation suggests it is cosmological, that the spirals and curves represent ideas about the nature of reality, about cycles and transformations, about the connections between different realms of existence. We cannot know for certain. The Celts left no written explanations of their art. We are left to interpret, to feel our way toward understanding through careful observation and informed imagination. What we can say is that this art was not produced in isolation. The Latin style emerged in the 5th century BCE, in a band of territory stretching from eastern France through southern Germany to Austria, the same region that had earlier been the heartland of the Hallstatt culture. It emerged at a moment of intensive contact with the Mediterranean world. Greek and Etruscan traders were moving north, bringing wine and fine pottery and metalwork. Celtic elites were eager consumers of these imports, which appear in rich burials across the region. The early Latin style shows clear influences from Greek art, the palmette, certain decorative schemes, but it quickly diverged, took these borrowed motifs and transformed them into something new. From this core area, the style spread. By the 4th century BCE, recognizably Latin metalwork was being produced across a vast area, from Britain to the Carpathians, from northern Italy to the Baltic. This spread was not uniform or instantaneous. Different regions developed their own substyles, their own preferences. British metalwork, especially in the late Iron Age, favored certain patterns and techniques that were rare on the continent. Eastern European smiths developed their own variations, but the underlying aesthetic remained consistent enough that specialists can recognize Latin art wherever it appears. How did this happen? How did an artistic style spread across such distances in a world without mass media, without art schools, without museums, where apprentices could study exemplars? The answer lies in the mobility of people and objects. Craftspeople traveled, seeking patronage, following opportunities. A skilled smith might work in one region for a season or a year, then move on, carrying techniques and styles with him. Elite gift-giving networks distributed prestige objects across Europe. A torc made in Gaul might end up in Britain, where local smiths would see it, admire it, copy its techniques. Marriage alliances brought people from distant regions together, along with their possessions and their aesthetic preferences. And warfare, raiding, migration, all of these moved people and objects, creating opportunities for cultural exchange even in conflict. But technology alone does not explain the art. We must also consider meaning. What did these objects mean to the people who made and used them? A torc was not just jewelry. In classical accounts, torcs are associated specifically with Celtic warriors and nobles. To wear one was to claim a particular identity. The Dying Gaul, the famous Hellenistic sculpture, wears nothing but a torc, naked, defeated. But his identity as a Celtic warrior, still proclaimed by that twisted ring of metal around his neck. When warriors died and were buried with their torcs, when torcs were cast into rivers as offerings, they were carrying that identity forward into the afterlife, into the realm of the gods. Mirrors, found in wealthy female burials, seem to have had similar identity functions, but gendered differently. The decorated backs of these mirrors, works of astonishing intricacy, patterns that must have taken days to engrave, were not meant to be seen during use. The reflective surface was on the other side. The decoration was for the gods, or for the dead, or for those moments when the mirror was displayed as an object, rather than used as a tool. Mirrors may have had magical associations. Their ability to capture reflections, suggesting otherworldly power. To be buried with such an object was to be buried with wealth, with beauty, with magic. Swords were invested with even more meaning. A sword was a warrior's companion, carried through battles, relied upon for survival. Classical sources mention Celtic warriors, giving names to their swords, talking to them, performing rituals over them. The decision to deposit a sword in a river or lake was not casual disposal of a broken tool. It was sacrifice, giving back to the gods something of immense value. Many deposited swords show signs of ritual killing, bent or broken before deposition, as if to release their spirit, to make them appropriate for the other world. And then there is the Gundistrup cauldron, perhaps the most famous single artifact of the Celtic Iron Age. Found in a Danish bog, it is a massive silver vessel, its panels decorated with a bewildering array of images. Gods or heroes, animals real and fantastic. Ritual scenes that seem to hint at myths we can only guess at. A horned figure sits cross-legged, surrounded by animals, wearing a torc. This is often identified as Cernunnos, a Celtic god, though the identification is uncertain. Warriors march in procession, some on horseback, some on foot. A giant figure holds a human upside down over a vessel, human sacrifice or ritual killing before battle. An elephant appears, an animal the Celts would have encountered only through contact with Mediterranean armies. The cauldron is Thracian in style, from southeastern Europe, but found in Denmark, far from any plausible Celtic heartland. Yet its imagery is recognizably Celtic, or at least Celtic influenced. It is a cosmopolitan object, made in one place, moved to another, embodying the interconnections of the Iron Age world. We must not romanticize this art. It was produced in a hierarchical society, for elite patrons, using resources extracted from the labor of many. The beautiful golden torcs represented not just craftsmanship but concentration of wealth, the ability to command gold and skilled labor. The decorated swords were weapons, tools of violence, however aesthetically pleasing their hilts. The hoards deposited in watery places represented enormous expenditure of resources that could have been used to feed people, to build shelters, to improve lives. The art of the Celtic Iron Age was, like all art, embedded in relations of power. But it was also genuine expression, the product of human creativity and skill, of aesthetic sensibilities, that valued certain forms and patterns and effects, that found meaning in curves and spirals, that saw beauty in the transformation of raw metal into objects that pleased the eye and satisfied the hand, and carried stories and identities forward through time. Standing in front of these objects today, behind glass in climate-controlled galleries, we are privileged to see them, but we see them out of context, stripped of the meanings they once carried. The torc that now sits motionless in a museum case, once encircled a living throat, felt the pulse of blood, was warmed by skin, was seen by people who understood immediately what it signified. The mirror that we admire for its decorative complexity, once reflected a face, was held in hands, was used in rituals we can only imagine. The sword that seems so elegant, was once heavy in a warrior's grip, was swung in anger and fear, was stained with blood before it was cleansed, and finally offered to the dark water. This is the language of metal, a language of skill and wealth, of identity and belief, of beauty, that served purposes we may never fully understand, but can still, after millennia, respond to. The swirling patterns still draw the eye. The craftsmanship still commands respect. The objects still speak, however imperfectly we hear them. They speak of a world where making things mattered, where objects carried weight beyond their material value, where art and life and death were inseparably woven together. And they speak of the people who made them, the smiths whose names are lost but whose work endures, whose skill and vision shaped metal into forms that would outlast empires, that would survive the collapse of their entire civilization, and remain, glowing softly under museum lights, waiting for us to learn their language. The Druids have been many things to many people, to the Romans who wrote about them. They were barbaric priests who performed human sacrifice in dark groves, to medieval Irish monks who preserved memories of them in written form. They were wise counselors and prophets, figures who anticipated Christian truth through pagan wisdom. To 18th century Romantics, they were mystical philosophers, keepers of ancient knowledge that connected them to the very dawn of human spirituality. To modern neo-pagans, they are ancestors in faith, models for contemporary practice. And to historians and archaeologists, they are frustratingly difficult to pin down, mentioned repeatedly in ancient sources, clearly important, yet leaving almost no direct archaeological trace. We must begin by stripping away the layers of later interpretation and returning to what can actually be said with some confidence. The Druids were a specialized class within Celtic society, focused primarily on religious functions, but with roles that extended beyond what we might narrowly define as religion. They performed sacrifices and interpreted omens. They presided over important rituals. They settled legal disputes and pronounced judgments. They taught young men of the elite class, passing on knowledge through memorization and oral recitation. They advised kings and chiefs. They may have had the power to stop battles simply by walking onto the field and demanding peace. They formed a kind of pan-tribal network, with Druids from different tribes recognizing each other, gathering for assemblies, maintaining traditions that crossed political boundaries. The most detailed classical account comes from Julius Caesar, who devoted several paragraphs to the Druids in his commentary on the Gallic Wars. Caesar notes that the Druids managed all religious matters, supervised public and private sacrifices, and interpreted religious questions. He says they had the power to excommunicate individuals from sacrifice, a serious punishment that made the victim an outcast, shunned by the community. He describes their educational system, young men coming to study with the Druids for up to 20 years, memorizing vast amounts of verse, forbidden to write down their knowledge. He claims the Druidic system originated in Britain, and that those who wanted to study the doctrine more thoroughly would travel there. Other classical writers add details. Strabo mentions 3 classes of religious specialists among the Gauls: bards, who are poets and singers, vates or ovates, who performed divination and sacrifices, and druids who studied philosophy and ethics in addition to religious matters. Pliny the Elder describes druidic veneration of oak trees and mistletoe, including a ritual where mistletoe was cut with a golden sickle, caught in a white cloak before it touched the ground, and used in ceremonies. He also mentions the Druids' belief in the healing and magical properties of certain plants. Tacitus, in his account of the Roman assault on Anglesey, describes Druids standing among the defenders, calling down curses on the invaders, though we should remember that Tacitus was writing propaganda, and his portrayal of Druids as figures of menace served Roman purposes. The Irish texts, written down centuries after the conversion to Christianity, but preserving earlier oral traditions, add more nuances. The Druids in these stories are advisors to kings, performing divination through various methods, observing the flight of birds, interpreting dreams, entering trance states to receive prophetic visions. They can shapeshift, control weather, cast curses, or blessings. They are teachers, with young heroes often spending time in Druidic fosterage, learning not just religious knowledge, but poetry, genealogy, law, and martial skills. They sometimes oppose Christianity in these later stories, but they are also sometimes portrayed sympathetically, as wise figures who recognize the truth of the new religion. What can we trust in all this? The classical sources are valuable but biased, written by outsiders who often misunderstood what they saw or shaped their accounts for rhetorical purposes. The Irish texts are later, and Christian, their portrayal of Druids filtered through medieval worldviews. Yet certain themes recur consistently enough to suggest underlying realities. The Druids were clearly a distinct social class, recognized across tribal boundaries. They clearly had religious functions, though what exactly Celtic religion entailed requires more discussion. They clearly had educational and legal roles. They clearly had high status with influence over political decisions. Beyond this, we must be cautious. The archaeological evidence is frustratingly indirect. We cannot identify Druid burials with certainty. There is no grave labeled "Here lies a Druid." We have no Druidic temples or schools or sanctuaries that can be definitively identified. What we have are traces of the religious practices. The Druids presumably managed ritual deposits, sacred spaces, the material culture of Celtic religion. And this material culture is distinctive, quite different from what we see in the Mediterranean world. The Celts did not build temples in the Greek or Roman fashion, rectangular stone buildings with columned porticos housing cult statues. There are a few exceptions, structures that might be called temples, but they are late and show Roman influence. For most of the Iron Age, Celtic sacred space was defined differently. It was often outside, in natural settings that were felt to have inherent power or that were marked out through human action. Sacred groves appear repeatedly in the sources. Natural clearings in forests, perhaps enhanced by clearing or planting, where major religious ceremonies took place. Lucan, a Roman poet, describes such a grove near Marseille: ancient trees, dark and sunless, dripping water from springs, crude statues of gods, everything stained with sacrificial blood. This is hostile propaganda, meant to horrify Roman readers. But the basic concept that groves were sacred spaces is probably accurate. A grove provides natural enclosure, defines sacred space without requiring constructed walls. Trees themselves, especially oaks, seem to have had religious significance. The word Druid itself may derive from roots meaning oak knowledge or oak seer, though this etymology is debated. Water was sacred. Rivers, springs, lakes, bogs, all were places where offerings were made. The evidence for this is overwhelming. Thousands of objects have been recovered from watery contexts across Celtic Europe. Weapons, jewelry, tools, human and animal remains. These were not casual losses. Many items were deliberately damaged before deposition, ritually killed to make them appropriate for the other world. The locations where they were deposited were often used repeatedly over centuries, suggesting they were known sacred sites. At Leyten itself, the site that gives its name to the art style, over 160 swords, hundreds of spears and other weapons, tools and jewelry were recovered from the lake shore. This was a major ritual center, a place where people came from considerable distances to make offerings. Why water? Heaps, because it was liminal boundary space between land and whatever lay beneath. The underworld, the realm of the gods. Heaps, because it was life-giving, essential for survival. Springs were especially significant, places where water emerged from the earth, where the underground and the surface world met. Many springs became long-lasting cult sites. The hot springs at Bath in Britain were sacred to the goddess Sulis long before the Romans came and built their elaborate temple complex. People left offerings there: coins, jewelry, curse tablets, asking for healing, for justice, for blessing. Hilltops were another form of sacred space, not just the hill forts we have discussed, though those certainly had ritual dimensions, but natural peaks and promontories. High places brought one closer to the sky, to the realm of gods associated with weather, with celestial phenomena, and they provided visibility. Fires lit on hilltops could be seen for miles, coordinating ceremonies, sending signals, marking time. And there were constructed sacred spaces, though different from temples. Four-post structures, mentioned earlier, appear at many sites. Four substantial posts set in a square, often with ritual deposits at their bases. Were these shrines, markers of sacred space, platforms for excarnation of the dead? We do not know. Rectangular wooden buildings that might have been temples appear at some late Iron Age sites. And there are the Virex Chanzen, square enclosures found across southern Germany and neighboring regions, ditched and sometimes banked rectangular areas, usually isolated from settlements, with evidence of ritual activity inside. Were these Druidic sanctuaries? The attribution is tempting but uncertain. What of the sacrifices? Classical sources are emphatic about Celtic human sacrifice, describing it in lurid detail: victims burned in wicker men, drowned in vats, stabbed, and their deaths observed for omens. This was propaganda, meant to justify Roman conquest as bringing civilization to barbarians. Yet there is archaeological evidence that cannot be dismissed. The bog bodies of northern Europe, preserved by the acidic, oxygen-free peat, include individuals who were clearly killed deliberately, strangled, throats cut, skulls bashed, before being placed in the bog. The most famous, like Tolland Man and Lindo Man, show signs of ritual treatment. Lindo Man had mistletoe pollen in his stomach, had been struck on the head, strangled, and had his throat cut. Triple killing, overkill, that suggests ritual rather than simple execution. Other human remains found in ritual contexts support the practice of human sacrifice, though probably on a limited scale, for special occasions. Most Celtic sacrifice seems to have involved animals: cattle, pigs, sheep, horses, dogs. The bones of these animals, carefully deposited in pits or water, are common finds. And there were other offerings: grain, pottery, metalwork, all the material wealth of the community, given to the gods in acknowledgement of dependence, in hope of favor, in response to crisis or celebration. What did the Celts believe? What cosmology, what theology underpinned these practices? This is where we must be most cautious, because the evidence is fragmentary and filtered. The Celts certainly believed in gods, multiple gods, though how many and what relationships existed between them is unclear. Caesar, in his usual fashion, describes the gods of Gaul by identifying them with Roman equivalents: Mercury, Jupiter, Mars, Minerva, which tells us almost nothing about Celtic concepts. Inscriptions from the Roman period name hundreds of deities, most of them local, associated with particular places or tribes. Some names recur more widely: Louv, Brigid, Cernunnos, suggesting gods with pan-Celtic worship, but details of their cults are scarce. The Celts apparently believed in an afterlife, though its nature is debated. Classical sources claim they believed souls were reborn in other bodies, a doctrine of reincarnation. Irish sources speak of the other world, a parallel realm where the gods and the dead lived, where time passed differently, where there was no sickness or aging. Access to this other world was through specific places: certain caves, islands, bodies of water. Heroes might venture there on quests, might return with knowledge or treasures, or might be trapped there forever. And the Celts believed in the power of place, in sacred geography. The land itself was alive, was inhabited by spirits and gods. Certain places, the spring, the hilltop, the boundary stone, the ancient burial mound, were charged with power, demanded respect, required proper ritual approach. To violate sacred space was to invite disaster. To honor it properly was to ensure prosperity. The Druids were the mediators of all this. The specialists who knew the proper rituals, who could interpret signs, who maintained the calendar and determined when festivals should be held, who preserved the genealogies and myths that connected people to gods and land. Their power was ultimately not military, but ideological. They could not force obedience through violence, but they could declare someone outcast, cut off from the community and the gods. In a world where identity was communal, where survival depended on social bonds, this was a terrible punishment. The Romans eventually suppressed the Druids, seeing them as centers of resistance. The assault on Anglesey was specifically aimed at destroying a Druidic stronghold. Laws were passed forbidding Druidic practices, and gradually the class disappeared, at least as a distinct organized group. In Ireland, never conquered by Rome, Druids persisted longer but were eventually Christianized, their roles taken over by monks and priests, their knowledge absorbed into new frameworks. But the sacred landscape endured. Springs continued to be venerated, now associated with Christian saints. Hilltops gained churches and chapels. Festivals were Christianized, but maintained their timing, still marking the turning of seasons. The Druids themselves became figures of legend and mystery, their actual practices lost, their memory preserved in stories that grew more fantastic with each telling. What remains now are questions more than answers, glimpses more than clear pictures. But those glimpses are enough to suggest a rich religious life, a world where the sacred was not separate from the everyday, but woven through it, where gods and spirits were near, where the proper performance of ritual maintained the cosmos, where specialists, Druids, guarded the knowledge that kept the world turning. By the 2nd century BCE, something new was emerging across Celtic Europe, settlements that could legitimately be called cities. These were the oppida, vast fortified towns that represented the culmination of centuries of social and political development. They were not hillforts grown large, though some developed from earlier hillforts. They were planned communities, often enclosing hundreds of hectares, with populations that must have numbered in the thousands, with evidence of urban planning, craft specialization, long-distance trade, centralized political authority. They challenge our assumptions about the development of cities, about the relationship between urbanism and state formation, about what was possible in Iron Age Europe before Roman conquest. The word oppidum is Latin, used by Caesar to describe the fortified towns he encountered in Gaul. Archaeologists have adopted it to describe a specific phenomenon: very large enclosed settlements of the late Iron Age, roughly 2nd century BCE to 1st century CE, distinguished from earlier hillforts by their size, their internal organization, and their economic functions. Not every large late Iron Age settlement was an oppidum. The term implies certain characteristics, substantial defenses, evidence of centralized planning, craft production at urban scale, extensive trade contacts, political functions as tribal capitals. Manching in Bavaria is one of the most extensively studied examples. Located on a terrace above the Danube, it enclosed an area of 380 hectares, nearly 1,000 acres, within ramparts that ran for over 7 kilometers. These were not simple earthworks. The walls used the Murus Gallicus technique, described by Caesar, a framework of heavy timbers nailed together with long iron nails, the spaces filled with earth and stone, the front face often reinforced with additional stonework. Building these ramparts required enormous resources, hundreds of thousands of hours of labor, massive quantities of timber, tons of iron for the nails alone. Archaeologists have estimated that the nails used in the Manching fortifications would have required 300 to 400 tons of iron, a staggering amount for a pre-industrial society. Inside the ramparts, a planned community. Geophysical surveys and excavations have revealed streets on a rough grid pattern, residential areas, with houses built in rows, industrial zones where particular crafts were concentrated. At Manching, archaeologists have identified areas specialized in ironsmithing, bronze working, pottery production, glass bead making, minting coins. This was not household production where each family made what it needed. This was specialized, workshop-based production, with craftspeople working full-time at their trades, probably producing for export as well as local consumption. The scale of production was impressive. At Manching, excavators found over 500 furnaces used for iron smelting and smithing. The quantity of slag, waste product, from metal production, runs to hundreds of tons. Similar evidence appears at other oppida. Bibracte in France shows extensive metalworking, with bronze, iron, and precious metal workshops. Colchester in Britain, ancient Camulodunum was a major centre for pottery production, with kilns producing thousands of vessels. The oppida were industrial centres, concentrating resources and labour in ways that allowed mass production, and they were commercial centres. Coins appear at oppida in large numbers: gold, silver, and bronze coins, minted locally, bearing designs that proclaim tribal identity. The coins show influence from Mediterranean prototypes, but are distinctly Celtic in style. They circulated widely, facilitating trade both within and between tribes. Some oppida, like Manching, show evidence of standardized weights and measures, suggesting regulated markets. Imported goods appear in quantity: wine amphorae from Italy, fine pottery from the Mediterranean, glass vessels, coral for jewelry. These were not isolated communities, but nodes in far-reaching trade networks. The populations were substantial. Estimates vary and depend on assumptions about settlement density, but most archaeologists agree that major oppida had populations in the thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, at the largest. Manching probably housed 5,000 to 10,000 people. Bibracte may have been similar. These numbers made them among the largest settlements in temperate Europe, comparable to many Mediterranean cities of the period. Who lived in these places? Certainly the elites, the aristocratic families who controlled resources and political authority. Their houses were larger, better built, often located in prominent positions, but also craftspeople, merchants, farmers from the surrounding territory who brought goods to market, probably dependent laborers and slaves. The oppida were socially diverse, bringing together people from different backgrounds, creating the conditions for cultural exchange and innovation that urban environments foster. The oppida were also political centers, capitals of tribal confederations. Bibracte was the main oppidum of the Aedui, one of the most powerful tribes in Gaul, Caesar's allies for much of his Gallic campaign. Manching was associated with the Vindelici. Colchester was the seat of the Cativella under their king Cannibalismus, the Cymbeline of Shakespeare's play. These were places where kings held court, where assemblies met, where decisions affecting the entire tribe were made. They were administrative centers, with officials who managed trade, collected tribute, organized labor for public works. And they had ritual functions. At Bibracte, a large rectangular enclosure has been interpreted as a sacred space, possibly a temple precinct. Many oppida have produced evidence of ritual deposits, offerings placed in boundaries, at gates, in special pits. The oppida were not just economic and political centers, but religious ones, places where major festivals would have been celebrated, where the gods of the tribe were honored. But the oppida were also vulnerable. Their size made them impressive, but it also made them dependent. A population of thousands cannot feed itself from within city walls. It requires a productive hinterland, farmers willing or compelled to bring their surplus to market, trade routes that remain open. Disruption of any of these could cause crisis, and the oppida were often located in positions that were not particularly defensible. Unlike earlier hill forts on high ground with steep approaches, many oppida sprawled across river terraces or gentle slopes. Their defense is impressive, but not impregnable. When Caesar came, many oppida fell quickly. Avaricum modern Bourges, which Caesar describes as the most beautiful city in Gaul, held out for weeks under siege before being stormed. Its entire population of 40,000, if we trust Caesar's numbers, massacred. Alesia, where Vercingetorix made his last stand, was a hill fort rather than an oppidum proper. Its defense is strong enough to require a massive siege effort. But most oppida did not resist to the end. Some opened their gates to the Romans, others were abandoned, their populations dispersing. A few, like Bibracte, survived into the early Roman period before being replaced by new Roman towns built in the valleys below. The abandonment of the oppida was not immediate everywhere. In areas that resisted Roman conquest longer, parts of Germany for example, oppida continued to function into the 1st century CE, but eventually, they all went the same way. Some were deliberately destroyed by the Romans, others were simply superseded. Roman administrative systems preferred different locations, and without political support, the oppida could not maintain their populations. By the late 1st century CE, most were ruins or had been replaced by Roman towns. The brief flowering of Celtic urbanism was over. Yet while they lasted, the oppida represented something remarkable. These were cities built without the cultural models of the Mediterranean, without the benefit of writing for administration, without the legal and financial instruments that supported Greek and Roman urbanism. They emerged from indigenous social and economic development, from the concentration of political power in the hands of tribal elites, from the intensification of production and trade, from the ability to mobilize and organize large populations. They demonstrate that urbanism, that the concentration of people in large planned settlements, is not dependent on any particular cultural tradition, but can arise wherever conditions, social, economic, political, are favorable. Walking through the remains of an oppidum today, what strikes you is the scale. How Bibracte, even though the site has been excavated for over a century, most of it remains buried. The outlines of buildings visible only as crop marks or slight depressions in the ground. But the ramparts still run for miles across the mountain, still rise impressively in places, still mark the boundary of this ancient city. You can walk the ancient streets, now just paths through grass and woods. You can stand where the forum once stood, where thousands would have gathered. You can visit the museum built on site, see the objects recovered from excavations, coins and pottery and metalwork, the everyday material of urban life. But you cannot recover the noise and smell and feel of the place when it was alive. You cannot hear the ring of hammers in the smithies, the voices in the marketplace, the music at festivals. You cannot see the houses with their thatched roofs, the smoke rising from hearths, the people in the streets, women carrying water from wells, merchants displaying goods, children playing, warriors gathering at the king's hall, craftspeople at their benches, the Druids performing ceremonies at the sacred enclosure. All that is gone, irretrievably, lost in the collapse that followed Roman conquest. What remains are the foundations, literal and figurative. The oppida laid groundwork, urban populations, craft specialization, trade networks, administrative structures that would be absorbed and transformed by Roman systems. Many Roman towns were built on or near oppidum sites, benefiting from existing infrastructure and settlement patterns. The social hierarchies and political relationships of the oppida period persisted in modified form under Roman rule, and the memory of the oppida of these great tribal capitals, lingered in later traditions, was written down by classical authors, was excavated by modern archaeologists. They stand now as testament to what Celtic societies achieved at their height in the last centuries before Roman conquest. They show us societies that were sophisticated, organized, capable of urban planning and large-scale construction, engaged in extensive trade, producing fine goods, supporting substantial populations. They give the lie to the stereotype of Celtic Europe as primitive or barbaric. These were civilizations in the fullest sense, different from Rome but not inferior, building cities in their own way, on their own terms, creating urban landscapes that would briefly flourish before being swept away by the tide of Roman expansion. The oppida deserve to be remembered, not just as footnotes in Roman history, as the cities Caesar conquered, but as achievements in their own right, as evidence of roads not taken, of alternative paths to complexity and urbanism that European history might have followed if Rome had not come when and how it did. The dead speak to us, if we know how to listen. Across Celtic Europe, thousands of burials have been excavated. Iron Age graves that range from simple pits containing a few possessions to elaborate chamber tombs filled with treasures. These graves are our most intimate connection to the people of the Iron Age, the places where individuals become visible, where we can see not just social patterns but personal choices, family relationships, moments of grief and memory. The graves tell us how people thought about death, about what came after, about the relationship between the living and the dead, and they tell us about social structure, about wealth and power, about how identity was constructed and displayed. The burial practices of the Celtic Iron Age varied considerably across time and space. There was no single Celtic way of treating the dead, but certain patterns recur, certain themes that suggest shared beliefs, or at least shared cultural frameworks. The practice of burial itself, placing the dead in the ground with grave goods, was not universal. We know from classical sources that some Celtic peoples exposed their dead, leaving bodies for birds and animals, or burned them and scattered the ashes. But burial was common enough, especially for elites, that we have substantial archaeological evidence to work with. In the Hallstatt period, roughly 800 to 450 BCE, the characteristic burial for high-status individuals was the wagon grave. A four-wheeled wagon or cart was placed in a large chamber, often lined with wood, sometimes under a substantial earthen mound. The dead person was laid on the wagon, dressed in fine clothing, adorned with jewelry. Around them were placed objects, bronze vessels, often imported from the Mediterranean, ceramic pots filled with food and drink, weapons for men, textile working equipment for women, sometimes animals, horses, cattle, even dogs. The wagons themselves were richly decorated, with bronze fittings, elaborate wheels, sometimes painted decoration on the wooden body. The most famous wagon burial is at Vix, in eastern France, where a woman, the Princess of Vix, though we don't know if she was actually a princess, was buried around 500 BCE in a chamber tomb beneath a mound. She wore a massive golden torc, one of the finest surviving pieces of Celtic metalwork, weighing nearly half a kilogram. With her was a bronze crater, a huge vessel for mixing wine and water, over 5 feet tall, made in a Greek workshop, and probably transported as a diplomatic gift. There were Etruscan bronze vessels, a silver cup, amber and coral jewelry. The lavishness of the burial, the imported luxuries, the golden torc, all proclaimed exceptional status. What does this burial tell us? That a woman in late Hallstatt society could hold very high status, could be buried with all the honors usually accorded to male warriors. That this community had access to Mediterranean trade goods. That someone thought it appropriate to place extraordinary wealth in a grave rather than keep it in circulation. That beliefs about the afterlife required furnishing the dead for a journey or for continued existence in another realm. That public display of wealth at funerals was important. That the funeral was a theatre where family status was proclaimed to the community. The Late 10 period, succeeding Hallstatt from roughly 450 BCE onward, saw changes in burial practice. Wagons became less common. Two-wheeled chariots appear in some warrior burials, especially in Britain and Eastern Gaul. The grave goods changed in style, reflecting the new artistic traditions of Late 10 metalwork. But the fundamental pattern furnished burials for elites. Grave goods appropriate to gender and status continued. Warrior burials are particularly informative. A typical example might include the body, usually male, laid in an extended position, or sometimes crouched. Beside him, his weapons, a sword in its scabbard, spears, a shield, sometimes a helmet, though these were rare and valuable. Often items of personal adornment, brooches, belt fittings, sometimes a torc, ceramic pots containing food and drink. Occasionally animals, especially pigs, source of the feast meat, and sometimes evidence of the funeral feast itself, animal bones, broken pottery, traces of fire, suggesting that eating and drinking were part of the burial ceremony. Female burials show different patterns. Instead of weapons, textile equipment, spindle whorls, loom weights, needles, jewelry, often elaborate, multiple brooches, necklaces, bracelets, anklets, mirrors in the wealthiest burials. The message is clear. Gender identity was important, was marked in death as in life. But we must be careful not to assume rigid binaries. A few burials show mixed grave goods, weapons with jewelry for example, and a few show ambiguous or multiple individuals that complicate simple gender categories. Child burials are heartbreaking. Many infant burials show minimal or no grave goods, perhaps reflecting beliefs that children who died young had not yet achieved full social personhood. But some child burials are rich, suggesting that status could be ascribed at birth, that the children of elites were accorded honor, even in death. At Glauberg in Germany, a child's burial included a golden neck ring and other precious objects, testimony to inherited status. And then there are the unusual burials, the ones that don't fit patterns, bodies buried in unusual positions, face down, crouched in fetal position, sitting upright. Burials without grave goods, multiple individuals in single graves, family tombs or slaves buried with masters, or victims of violence buried together. Burials with evidence of trauma, weapon wounds, broken bones, execution-style killing. These outliers remind us that archaeology shows us averages and patterns, but real life was messier, more varied, full of individual stories we can only guess at. The burial mounds themselves varied in size. Ols, the largest, covering elite graves, were substantial earthworks, visible landmarks for miles around. These were not just graves but monuments, territorial markers, embodiments of family prestige. They remained visible for generations, reminders of ancestors, perhaps places where descendants came to perform ceremonies, to invoke ancestral aid, to maintain connections across the boundary of death. Many burial grounds show long use over centuries. The same locations were chosen repeatedly, creating cemeteries that held hundreds of graves. This suggests continuity, attachment to place, perhaps beliefs that the dead formed communities of their own, that later burials joined earlier ones in some collective existence. Some cemeteries show patterns, burials in rows, oriented in consistent directions, clustered by family or status. Others seem more chaotic, suggesting less planning or different beliefs about proper arrangement of the dead. What did the Celts believe about death and afterlife? The grave goods suggest continuation, that the dead needed food and drink, needed tools and weapons, needed familiar objects. This might imply belief in an afterlife, where normal activities continued. Or it might be symbolic, the objects representing the identity of the deceased rather than practical provisions, or both symbols that were also understood as functional in the other world. Classical sources claim the Celts believed in reincarnation, that souls passed from one body to another. If true, this creates an interesting paradox with furnished burials. Why provide grave goods if the soul is reborn elsewhere? Perhaps the beliefs were more complex, a period in the grave or the other world before rebirth, or different beliefs for different people, or change over time. The Irish sources speak of the other world as a parallel realm, not sequential to this life, but coexisting with it, accessible through special places, or at special times. The dead might go there while somehow also remaining in their graves, present when descendants came to honor them. The ritual killing of objects, bending swords, breaking pottery, perforating vessels, before placing them in graves, suggests belief that objects, like people, have spirits that must be released or transformed to accompany the dead. The object's spirit could then serve the dead person's spirit in the other world. This is speculation, but it makes sense of otherwise puzzling behavior. And what of cremation? Cremation burials become more common in some regions during the late Iron Age. The body was burned on a pyre, the bones collected, placed in a pot or pit, sometimes with burnt grave goods. Was this a different belief system, or just a different method achieving the same end, properly dispatching the dead to the afterlife? Cremation was probably cheaper than furnished inhumation, requiring less grave goods, less labor for tomb construction. Its adoption might reflect economic factors as much as belief. The presence of grave goods creates its own problems. Rich burials represent enormous expenditure, wealth that could have been used by the living, but was instead consigned to the earth. Economists and archaeologists have long debated this. Is it pure waste, conspicuous consumption destroying wealth to demonstrate that a family could afford to? Or is it investment, the funeral creating social capital, obligations and debts that benefit the surviving family? Probably both. A lavish funeral proclaimed status, created memories, incurred obligations from those who attended and witnessed. It was simultaneously economic loss and social gain. The graves also show us inequality. The gap between the richest burials, chamber tombs with imported luxuries, and the poorest shallow pits with broken pots was enormous. This was not an egalitarian society. A small elite controlled most wealth, displayed it in life and in death. The majority had modest burials or none at all. Many bodies, perhaps most, left no archaeological trace, excavated, cremated, and scattered, buried in ways that have not survived. But within that framework of inequality, we see individual stories. At Wetwang in Britain, a woman was buried in her chariot. Unusual for female burials, was she a warrior, a queen, someone whose life story demanded exceptional treatment? At Hockdorf in Germany, a man was buried around 550 BCE on a bronze couch, surrounded by bronze vessels, wearing gold jewelry, his body accompanied by a huge cauldron that had held mead. The care taken with this burial, the construction of the chamber, the placement of objects, the sheer quantity of wealth, speaks of genuine grief, of desire to honor the dead, not just display status. These were real people. The bones tell us about their lives, diet, health, injuries, causes of death. Isotope analysis reveals where they grew up, whether they migrated. DNA analysis shows family relationships, population movements. The skeletal remains become individuals again, no longer abstract, Iron Age people, but specific humans with specific lives. Stand in a museum looking at grave goods, the sword, the mirror, the torque, the pots, and try to imagine. Imagine the funeral, the community gathered, the body prepared and dressed, the laments sung, the speeches given, the animals sacrificed, the feast shared. Imagine the grave being filled, the mound raised, the mourners departing. Imagine generations passing, the mound becoming a familiar landmark, children playing near it, adults pointing it out. That's where the ancestor lies, until eventually even the memory fades, the mound erodes, the land is ploughed, and finally, millennia later, archaeologists with their careful methods and their scientific instruments bring it all back to light. The dead speak, but softly, in fragments. They tell us what was placed with them, but not why. They tell us they were important enough for someone to invest in their burial, but not how they felt about their lives, their deaths, what they hoped came after. They tell us about social structures and beliefs, but not about love, about grief, about the irreplaceable loss that every death represents. The graves are both revealing and silent, both generous with information and maddeningly incomplete. But they are what we have, the voices from the grave, and we must listen to them as carefully as we can. Iron Age Europe was not isolated. Stand at an excavated site in southern Germany and handle a piece of coral jewelry. The coral came from the Mediterranean, perhaps from waters off North Africa or southern Italy, traveled overland through the Alps, changed hands multiple times before ending up here, hundreds of miles from any sea. Pick up an amber bead from a burial in France. The amber came from the Baltic coast, traveled down ancient routes through Central Europe, carried by traders who moved between worlds. Examine an Etruscan bronze vessel from a burial in Burgundy, made in northern Italy, transported across the Alps as trade good or diplomatic gift, valued enough to be placed in a grave rather than used by the living. These objects are proof of connection, of networks that stretched across the continent, linking the Atlantic to the Black Sea, the Mediterranean to the Baltic. The Iron Age world was permeable, constantly moving goods and ideas and people across political boundaries, across linguistic divides, across ecological zones. Trade was fundamental to Celtic societies, providing access to resources that were locally unavailable, creating wealth for those who controlled trade routes, fostering cultural exchange that influenced everything from art to social organization. The mechanisms of trade varied. At the highest level, there was elite gift exchange, diplomatic presents between rulers, marriages that included dowries of precious objects, rewards for military service, hospitality gifts when important visitors came. This was not trade in the commercial sense, not buying and selling for profit, but exchange that created and maintained political relationships. A golden torque given as gift was simultaneously economic transfer and political statement, creating obligation, declaring alliance. It was not trade in the commercial sense, not buying and selling for profit, but there was also more commercial trade, merchants traveling with goods, setting up at market days in oppidum and hillforts, buying and selling for profit. By the late Iron Age, the presence of coined money suggests market exchange was significant. Coins made transactions easier, allowed accumulation of abstract wealth, facilitated trade across linguistic barriers. The oppida show evidence of permanent market infrastructure, open spaces that might have been marketplaces, storage buildings, the concentration of goods from distant sources. And there was probably low-level trade too, informal exchange between neighbors, peddlers carrying small goods from village to village, opportunistic swapping when people met, a farmer with surplus grain trading for salt from a coastal community, a herder exchanging wool for pottery, a smith taking payment for repairs in food rather than coin. This level of exchange is nearly invisible archaeologically, but was probably the most common. The trade routes themselves followed natural corridors. Rivers were primary highways. The Danube, the Rhine, the Rhone, the Seine, all were arteries, along which goods and people moved. River travel was easier than overland. Could move bulk goods that would be impractical to carry by pack animal. The major oppida were almost always located on or near navigable rivers, positioned to control trade passing along them. Mountain passes were crucial choke points. The Alpine passes, the Brenner, the Great St. Bernard, passes through the Julian Alps, connected the Mediterranean world to temperate Europe. Control of these passes was a source of power and wealth. Hallstatt, the site that gave its name to the early Iron Age culture, was positioned near important routes through the Alps, and its wealth derived in part from this strategic location. Coastal routes followed the shorelines, island hopping, where possible, portaging across peninsulas. The Atlantic route brought tin from Cornwall and Brittany southward, perhaps all the way to the Mediterranean. The Baltic amber route went south through Central Europe, following various paths, but generally moving through regions that are now Poland, Czech Republic, and Austria, before reaching the Alps and Italy. But the routes were not fixed. They shifted based on political circumstances, on changes in demand, on the rise and fall of controlling powers. When one route became dangerous or blocked, traders found alternatives. The network was flexible, resilient, constantly adapting. What goods moved along these routes? Metals were fundamental. Whole tin, essential for bronze production, was relatively rare. The major sources in Europe were Cornwall, Brittany, and parts of Iberia. This tin moved across the continent. Even after iron became the dominant metal for tools and weapons, bronze was still used for fine metalwork, for prestige objects, for specific applications where its properties, easier to cast, easier to repair, made it preferable to iron. Copper came from various sources: the Alps, Wales, Ireland, Iberia, the Carpathians. Iron ore was widespread, but quality varied, and control of particularly good sources was valuable. Gold came from Transylvania, Ireland, western France, various placer deposits in rivers. Silver from the same sources, often as a byproduct of lead mining. Salt was crucial, though it leaves little archaeological trace. Salt was necessary for preserving meat and fish, for cheese-making, probably for ritual uses. The major source in Central Europe was the Hallstatt region, where rock salt could be mined. Elsewhere, salt was obtained by evaporating seawater or by processing water from brine springs. Control of salt sources generated substantial wealth. Amber was a luxury item, highly valued for jewelry. It came primarily from the Baltic coast, where it washes up on beaches, fossilized resin from ancient forests. Amber appears in burials across Celtic Europe, always in high-status contexts, proof of far-reaching trade connections. Coral was another luxury, used for inlay and metalwork, for beads. Mediterranean coral, bright red, was particularly prized. It appears in Celtic jewelry from Britain to Bohemia. Slaves were traded, though the scale is debated. Classical sources mention Celtic slaves in Roman markets. Warfare probably produced captives who were sold or ransomed, but we should not assume industrial-scale slave trading. The numbers were probably modest compared to later historical periods. Wine was major import, especially in the late Iron Age. Mediterranean wine came in distinctive amphorae, ceramic vessels, that archaeologists can trace by their shapes and fabrics. Wine consumption became a marker of elite status in Celtic society, a fashion borrowed from the Mediterranean world. The enormous quantities of amphorae found at some oppida, thousands of vessels, testify to substantial wine trade. Fine pottery moved too: Greek red figure and black figureware, later Aratineware from Italy. These were luxury items, display pieces, often placed in burials to demonstrate wealth and cultural sophistication. Glass came from the Mediterranean: glass beads, glass vessels, raw glass that Celtic craftspeople could rework. Glass-making technology eventually spread north, and by the late Iron Age, Celtic workshops were producing their own glass beads, though Mediterranean glass remained prestigious import. Textiles probably moved extensively, but rarely survive. The classical sources mention Celtic textiles, particularly brightly coloured and patterned fabrics. These may have been export items, though proving this archaeologically is difficult. We know textile production was important in Celtic society. The ubiquity of spindle whorls and loom weights in excavations testifies to this. Some of that production was probably for trade. Furs from northern Europe probably moved south: bear, wolf, beaver, marten. These would have been luxury items in warmer climates, valued for clothing and display. Food moved locally, grain from agricultural surplus areas to oppida and hillforts, livestock driven to market, preserved foods like smoked fish or cheese. Long-distance food trade was probably limited by preservation challenges, though dried, salted, or smoked foods could travel, and ideas moved: artistic styles, religious concepts, technological innovations, political structures. When a Celtic smith saw an Etruscan bronze vessel, he didn't just see an object to trade, he saw techniques to learn, designs to adapt. When elites adopted Mediterranean wine-drinking customs, they weren't just enjoying a beverage, they were importing social practices, rituals of hospitality and feasting that reshaped their own traditions. The scale of trade increased over time. In the Hallstatt period, trade with the Mediterranean was significant but focused on elite goods. By the late La Tène period, trade was more extensive, more commercial, involving greater volumes and wider participation. The oppida were fundamentally trade-oriented settlements, their economies dependent on their roles as regional commercial centers. But trade created dependencies and vulnerabilities. Communities that specialized in production for trade were vulnerable to disruptions. If routes were cut, if trading partners collapsed, the economic consequences could be severe. The late Iron Age sees evidence of economic stress: abandoned settlements, hordes of coins buried and never recovered, disruption of production. Some of this may have resulted from warfare, but some probably reflected economic crises when trade networks failed. Roman expansion disrupted and eventually transformed Celtic trade. Roman demand for certain goods, slaves, metals, agricultural products, intensified some trade routes. Roman infrastructure, roads, ports, centralized administration made trade easier in some ways. But Roman conquest also destroyed the political structures that had organized Celtic trade, replaced indigenous networks with Roman ones, reoriented economies toward Roman needs. Yet the basic pattern, goods moving across Europe along river routes and mountain passes, elite consumption of exotic imports, craft specialization producing for distant markets, persisted. Roman trade built on foundations laid in the Iron Age, used routes pioneered by Celtic and pre-Celtic traders, adapted networks that had developed over centuries. Walk through a museum's Iron Age galleries and pay attention to where objects came from. The coral from the Mediterranean, in a German burial, the amber from the Baltic in a French grave, the tin from Cornwall in a bronze sword found in Austria. Each object traveled, changed hands, crossed boundaries, connected distant places and people who never met, but whose lives were linked through trade. The Celtic world was not isolated or self-contained. It was part of a broader Iron Age world system, connected to the Mediterranean, to the steppes, to the north. Trade created wealth, fostered cultural exchange, made possible the elaborate metalwork and rich burials and substantial settlements. It also created inequalities. Those who controlled trade routes grew rich, while others remained marginal. It created dependencies on distant sources for crucial materials, and it created vulnerabilities to disruption, to conquest by more organized trade-oriented states like Rome. But before those vulnerabilities were fully exposed, before Roman conquest, the trade networks of Iron Age Europe represented a remarkable achievement. Hundreds of thousands of square miles, linked by exchange, goods moving along routes that stretched for thousands of miles, an economic system that, while not capitalist in any modern sense, was sophisticated, extensive and fundamental to Celtic civilization. When classical writers discussed Celtic societies, they often noted, with varying degrees of surprise or disapproval, the status of women. Women could hold property, women could rule as queens, women could fight as warriors, women served as religious authorities. This did not mean Celtic societies were egalitarian, or that gender didn't matter. Clearly it did, as burial evidence and literary sources both show. But it did mean that gender roles were more fluid, or at least differently structured, than in the Mediterranean world, where Greek and Roman women of respectable families were expected to remain largely confined to domestic spheres. The archaeological evidence for high-status women is substantial. We've already discussed the Princess of Vix, buried with extraordinary wealth in the late 6th century BCE. But she is not alone. Across Celtic Europe, excavations have revealed wealthy female burials that match or exceed contemporary male burials in the quantity and quality of grave goods. At Reinheim in Germany, a woman was buried in the 4th century BCE, with a golden torque, massive bronze rings, a bronze mirror, ornate jewelry, and imported vessels. At Waldeggisheim, another wealthy female burial, included elaborate goldwork and an Etruscan bronze vessel. In Britain, the Wetwang chariot burial, mentioned earlier, shows a woman accorded the exceptional honor of burial with a chariot, treatment more commonly reserved for male warriors. These were not ordinary women. The wealth in their graves marks them as members of the highest elite, possibly rulers in their own right, possibly wives or mothers of rulers, possibly religious specialists. The goods placed with them, personal jewelry, feasting equipment, imported luxuries, suggest they participated in the public sphere, in feasting and gift-giving networks, in the display of wealth that created and maintained social bonds. Classical sources provide names and stories, though we must read them critically. Cartimandua, queen of the Brigantes in northern Britain during the Roman invasion, ruled in her own right, made treaties with Rome, led her tribe through decades of complex politics. When her husband Venucius rebelled against her, and against her alliance with Rome, she defeated him with Roman help and continued ruling. Caesar mentions women participating in councils and military leadership among the Gauls. Tacitus describes Boudica, queen of the Iceni, leading a massive rebellion against Rome after the death of her husband, commanding armies, besieging Roman settlements, nearly driving the invaders from Britain before her ultimate defeat. These accounts must be read carefully. Roman writers often exaggerated or misunderstood Celtic practices, and they had their own agendas, portraying Celtic queens as exotic or savage, served Roman propaganda purposes. But the recurring theme of female authority, appearing in multiple sources in different regions, suggests underlying reality. Celtic political structures allowed for female rule in ways that Greek and Roman structures did not. How common was female rule? Probably rare, as male rule was the norm. But the possibility existed. The precedent was established. The social structures could accommodate it. Succession systems that valued kinship over strict patrilineal descent made female rule possible when circumstances favored it. When a ruler died without male heirs, when a queen was particularly capable, when political alliances required a female ruler, the system was flexible enough to adapt. What about female warriors? Classical sources mention women fighting, sometimes as normal warriors, sometimes as special shock troops. Archaeological evidence is more ambiguous. Some burials contain both traditionally male goods, weapons, and traditionally female goods, jewelry, textile equipment. But these are rare, and their interpretation is debated. Were these female warriors, gender non-conforming individuals, burials that included goods of different people, special ritual circumstances that required mixing gender markers? We must be cautious about projecting modern categories onto ancient societies. Celtic concepts of gender may have been different from ours, may have recognized more than two categories, may have allowed for crossing or combining. The occasional burial that doesn't fit neat male-female patterns reminds us of this complexity. Most burials do show clear gender differentiation. Weapons with men, textile equipment with women, different styles of jewelry, different burial positions. But the exceptions matter, show us that the rules were not absolute. Religious authority seems to have been accessible to women. Classical sources mention female druids, though less frequently than male druids. Tacitus describes female religious specialists among the Britons. Irish sources speak of banfili, female poets, and banfili, female seers, religious specialists with powers similar to male druids. The conflation of religious and political authority in Celtic societies meant that women with religious knowledge could wield substantial influence. Some scholars have argued for goddess worship as particularly important in Celtic religion, with female deities more prominent than in Mediterranean pantheons. The evidence is complicated. Many deity names from inscriptions are female: Brigid, Epona, Rosmerta, many local goddesses associated with springs or groves. But we also have male deity names, and the actual practices of worship are difficult to reconstruct. Whether goddess worship translated into higher status for mortal women is unclear, but it may have provided cultural models for female authority, religious frameworks that legitimized women's power. The economic roles of women were crucial, even if less visible. Textile production was primarily female work in Iron Age Europe, as in most pre-industrial societies. This was not trivial labor. Textiles were valuable, took enormous time to produce, were essential for clothing and bedding and trade. Women controlled this production, possessed the specialized knowledge of spinning, weaving, dyeing. In doing so, they controlled significant economic resources. Women probably also dominated food processing, turning grain into flour and bread, preserving meat, making cheese and butter, brewing beer. Again, this was skilled work, essential for survival, requiring specialized knowledge. The women who controlled household production had real power. even if it was exercised in domestic rather than public spheres. And women were central to kinship networks. Marriage alliances connected elite families, created political bonds, transferred property and resources. Women were the links in these networks, moving between families, maintaining connections, raising children who would inherit and perpetuate the alliances. This was not a passive role. Women negotiated, advised, worked to advance their own interests and those of their children. Classical sources occasionally mention Celtic women as advisors to husbands, as influential in political decisions, as negotiators in disputes. But we must not romanticize. Women in Celtic societies were still constrained by patriarchy, still subject to male authority in many contexts, still victims of violence in warfare and raiding, still limited in ways that modern egalitarian values would find unacceptable. The wealthy burials and the classical accounts of queens are elite phenomena. Most women's lives were hard, shaped by agricultural labor, by childbearing and child-rearing, by vulnerability to disease and violence and hunger. For every queen who appears in the historical record, thousands of ordinary women lived and died, leaving no trace beyond perhaps a modest burial or scattered bones in a settlement midden. The Vix princess or the Reinheim woman were exceptional precisely because they were exceptional. Their burials stand out because most women, most people, were buried with far less. But their very exceptionality tells us something important: that Celtic social structures could accommodate female power at the highest levels, that the rigid gender hierarchies of some other ancient societies were not universal, that women could rule, could fight, could wield religious authority, could be buried with all the honors of male elites. This matters for our understanding of Celtic societies. It reminds us that patriarchy takes different forms in different cultures, that women's status is not everywhere and always the same, that historical change is possible because historical variation exists. The Celtic Iron Age was not a golden age for women. No historical period has been that. But it does seem to have offered elite women at least more opportunities for public authority and recognition than contemporary Mediterranean societies did. And perhaps it offered ordinary women something too. Not equality, not freedom from constraint, but perhaps a bit more flexibility, a bit more space for negotiation and influence. We cannot know for certain. The evidence is fragmentary, biased toward elites, filtered through male observers with their own agendas. But the recurring pattern, high-status female burials, female rulers in historical sources, women in religious authority, suggests that Celtic gender systems, while still patriarchal, were not as rigidly hierarchical as others, allowed for more variation, created more possibilities. Standing before a display of grave goods from a wealthy female burial, the golden torque, the bronze mirror, the imported vessels, we should think about the woman who once wore and used these objects. We don't know her name. We don't know if she ruled as queen, or served as priestess, or was simply wealthy, but we know she mattered. Someone cared enough to bury her with extraordinary wealth, to mark her grave with a mound, to ensure she would be remembered. Her grave survived. Archaeologists found it. Museum visitors see her treasures. In that sense, the commemoration worked. Across 2,500 years, we acknowledge her importance. We recognize her status. We grant her the respect her community intended. The Celtic world and the Roman world were on collision course for centuries before the final conquest. The first major encounter came in 387 BCE, when a Celtic warband, led by a chief the Romans called Brennus, sacked Rome itself. The city was captured, burned, the population fled, or was killed, the capital besieged. Only payment of a massive ransom in gold allowed the Romans to be rid of the invaders. The story, as told by Roman historians writing centuries later, was one of humiliation and trauma. When the ransom was being weighed, the Celtic chief allegedly threw his sword onto the scales and declared Vae Victis, woe to the conquered. Whether this actually happened is doubtful, but the story reveals how deeply the sack of Rome scarred Roman consciousness. For the next 2 centuries, Romans and Celts fought repeatedly in northern Italy. The Pot Valley and the regions south of the Alps had been settled by Celtic tribes in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, creating what Romans called Cisalpine Gaul on this side of the Alps. This was rich agricultural land, and both Celts and Romans wanted it. Wars were frequent, Roman expansion northward meeting Celtic resistance. Major battles were fought at the Alaia, at Sentinum, at Telamon. Roman military organization and discipline eventually prevailed, and by the end of the 2nd century BCE, northern Italy was under Roman control, its Celtic population either subjugated or expelled. But Gaul beyond the Alps remained free and powerful. The Gallic tribes, the Arverni, the Aedui, the Sequani, the Helvetii, dozens of others, were rich, populous, capable of fielding large armies. They traded with Rome, sometimes allied with Rome, but they were not Roman subjects. When Julius Caesar arrived as governor of Cisalpine Gaul and Transalpine Gaul, the Roman province in southern France in 58 BCE, he inherited a complex political situation. Some Gallic tribes were Roman allies, others were hostile, still others were neutral, but watchful. What followed was one of the most consequential military campaigns in history. Caesar's Gallic Wars, which he himself described in his commentaries, lasted from 58 to 50 BCE and resulted in the conquest of all of Gaul, the destruction or subjugation of its tribes, the transformation of Celtic Europe's most populous region into a Roman province. The human cost was staggering. Caesar claims in his writings to have killed 1 million Gauls and enslaved another million. These numbers are probably exaggerated. Caesar was writing propaganda, justifying his wars, portraying himself as a great general. But even if the true numbers were half his claims, the scale of death and enslavement was enormous. The military details need not concern us here. The sieges, the battles, the marches, the logistics. These are well documented in Caesar's account and in modern military histories. What matters for understanding Celtic civilization is what conquest meant, how it happened, why resistance failed. Celtic military prowess was real. Celtic warriors were brave, well-equipped, experienced in warfare. The cavalry was particularly effective. In open battle, Celtic armies could challenge Roman legions. But Celtic political organization was fragmented. The tribes were independent, often rivals, sometimes at war with each other. When Caesar came, he exploited these divisions, allying with some tribes against others, using Gallic auxiliaries in his armies, promising rewards to collaborators. Unity came too late. By the time Vercingetorix managed to create a broad coalition of tribes in 52 BCE, Caesar had already defeated many of them separately. The siege of Alesia, where Vercingetorix made his last stand, was military masterpiece. Caesar surrounding the hillfort with elaborate fortifications, then building outer fortifications to hold off a massive relief army. When Vercingetorix finally surrendered to spare his followers, organized resistance collapsed. But we must not portray this as inevitable, as Celtic barbarians being swept away by superior Roman civilization. The Romans won because of specific advantages: superior logistics, engineering expertise, professional armies that could campaign year-round, political unity under one command. And they won because of Celtic disunity, because enough tribal leaders decided that accommodation with Rome offered better prospects than resistance. After conquest, many Celtic elites adopted Roman citizenship, served in Roman administration, intermarried with Roman officials. Their descendants would consider themselves Roman, speak Latin, build villas in Roman style. The process called Romanization was complex negotiation, not simple imposition. Britain came later. Caesar made 2 brief expeditions to Britain in 55 and 54 BCE. But these were raids rather than conquest, demonstrating Roman reach, but not establishing control. Real conquest began under Claudius in 43 CE, and took decades to complete. The lowlands were subdued relatively quickly, but Wales and northern England resisted longer. Boudicca's revolt in 60 CE nearly drove the Romans out. Wales was not fully pacified until the campaigns of the 70s CE. Scotland was never fully conquered. Hadrian's Wall marked the limit of effective Roman control. In unconquered areas, Ireland, northern Scotland, parts of Germany beyond the Rhine, Celtic societies continued to develop on their own trajectories. Ireland in particular remained Celtic, never experiencing Roman conquest. Its Iron Age culture, evolving into the early medieval period, eventually being transformed not by military conquest, but by Christianization. The Irish texts, written down by Christian monks, preserve memories of Iron Age society, distorted, Christianized, but still recognizable. They show us what Celtic civilization might have become if Rome had not intervened. In conquered areas, Celtic culture didn't vanish overnight. Language persisted for generations, eventually evolving into the Romance languages of France and Iberia, but leaving its mark in place, names in loan words, probably in syntax and pronunciation. Religious practices were adapted, Celtic gods identified with Roman equivalents, sacred springs and groves continuing to be venerated, even as Roman temples were built nearby. Material culture blended. Celtic art styles influenced Roman provincial art. Roman technologies were adopted by Celtic craftspeople. But the independence was gone. The political structures, the tribes, the kings, the Druid councils, were either destroyed or transformed into Roman administrative units. The oppida were abandoned or replaced by Roman towns. The warrior aristocracy either entered Roman service or lost its purpose. The elaborate burial customs faded as Romanization progressed. By the 2nd century CE, in most of the formerly Celtic lands, you would have been hard-pressed to distinguish the descendants of Celts from other provincial Romans, yet memory persisted. In the margins, in Ireland, in Wales, in Scotland, in Brittany, Celtic languages and traditions survived, were written down, were preserved, and eventually celebrated. When medieval scribes recorded the stories of Arthur, or the Mabinogion, they were drawing on older traditions, however transformed. When Renaissance scholars began to study these texts, they recognized something: a lost world, a different Europe that had existed before Rome, had flourished briefly, had been conquered, but not entirely erased. Standing at Alesia today, where Vercingetorix surrendered, and the fate of Celtic Gaul was sealed, you can walk the Roman siege works, banks and ditches still visible after 2,000 years, monument to Roman military engineering. A modern statue of Vercingetorix stands on the hillfort summit, erected by Napoleon III in the 19th century, part of a French nationalist project to claim Celtic heritage. The statue is romanticized, heroic, portraying Vercingetorix as noble defender of freedom against foreign tyranny. The reality was messier. Vercingetorix was an aristocrat, fighting to preserve his class's privileges. His coalition was temporary and fragile. His defeat was as much due to Celtic disunity as Roman strength. But the statue acknowledges something important: that Celtic Europe mattered. That what was lost at Alesia was not just one tribe's political independence, but an entire civilization's autonomy, a different path of development that Europe might have followed. We can't know what would have happened if Rome had not conquered. Whether Celtic oppida would have evolved into medieval cities, whether Druidic tradition would have developed into something like a church, whether new political structures would have emerged to unify larger territories. History doesn't reveal its alternatives. What we can say is that the Celtic Iron Age represented a high point of indigenous European development, a civilization that was sophisticated, creative, capable of building cities and creating art and organizing labor and engaging in long-distance trade, all without the benefit of Mediterranean models. It was not paradise. It was hierarchical, violent, often harsh. But it was impressive, and it was ended by Roman conquest, not by any internal collapse or inability to adapt. The shadow of Rome, of Roman power, Roman culture, Roman memory, has fallen across Celtic history ever since. We know the Celts primarily through Roman sources, see them through Roman eyes, measure them against Roman standards. Even modern archaeology, with all its sophisticated techniques, struggles to see past Roman influence. It's difficult to imagine the Celtic Iron Age on its own terms, as its own civilization, rather than as prelude to Rome or as Rome's conquered periphery. But we must try. The Celtic world before Rome, the world of hillforts and oppida, of druids and warrior queens, of exquisite metalwork and sacred groves, of tribes and confederations spanning the continent, deserves to be understood as more than footnote. It was one possible way of organizing society, one path toward complexity and civilization. That it was cut short does not make it less significant. That it left fewer written records than Rome does not make it less real. The stones and bones and bronze, the earthworks and the graves, testify to its reality. And in the margins where it survived, in language and story and memory, it testifies to its persistence, its refusal to be entirely forgotten. We return now to where we began. Standing on the ramparts of a hillfort, wind across ancient heights, grass covering what were once bustling defenses. But we see it differently now. The grass is not simply grass, but earth moved by human hands 2,000 years ago. The gentle slope is not natural, but engineered, a glossis designed to expose attackers. The view from the ramparts is not just scenic, but strategic. Sight lines to approaching enemies, to neighboring settlements, to the river below where trade goods moved. We have walked through the Celtic Iron Age, from its emergence in the Hallstatt period to its conquest by Rome. We have seen hillforts rise and oppida flourish, and rich burials proclaim elite status. We have followed trade routes that spanned the continent, examined metalwork of breathtaking beauty, considered religious practices that left no temples but marked the landscape with meaning. We have met queens and warriors, craftspeople and druids, remembered in story and bone and bronze. What remains? Legacy is complicated, layered, often contested. The Celtic languages survive: Irish, Scottish Gaelic, Welsh, Breton, Cornish. revived from near extinction. Manx also revived. These are living connections to the Iron Age, linguistic descendants of the tongues spoken in the oppida and hillforts. They carry within them ancient words, old ways of thinking about the world, preserved structures that predate Latin and Germanic influence. The speakers of these languages are the inheritors of a tradition that stretches back millennia. The place names survive too. Rivers, the Thames, the Trent, the Severn in Britain, the Rhine, the Rhone, the Seine on the continent, bear names that are Celtic in origin. Mountains, forests, settlements. Many of their names come from Celtic roots, sometimes barely recognizable, after 2,000 years of linguistic change. But there, if you know how to look. The land remembers its old names, even when people forget their meanings. The stories survive, transformed but recognizable. The Arthurian legends, recorded in medieval Welsh and French and English texts, draw on older Celtic traditions. The hero who defends his people, the sacred objects, the Grail echoing earlier Celtic cauldrons, the otherworld journeys, the fellowship of warriors. The Mabinogion preserves stories that may have been old when they were written down in the Middle Ages. Memories of giant kings and magical transformations, of conflicts between kingdoms, of the interweaving of human and divine. And the art survives, not just in museums, but in influence. The swirling patterns of Leifan art reappear in medieval Celtic manuscripts, in the illuminations of the Book of Kells and the Lindisfarne Gospels. They influence art nouveau in the 19th century, appear in modern Celtic-inspired jewelry and tattooing. The aesthetic that emerged 2,500 years ago still speaks to something, still appeals, still finds new expressions. But we must be careful about claiming too much continuity. The Celtic Iron Age world was ended by Roman conquest. What survived did so in changed form, adapted to new circumstances, mixed with Roman and Christian and Germanic influences. Modern Celtic identity is 19th and 20th century construction, as much as ancient inheritance. Scholars and nationalists and cultural revivalists, selecting elements from the past, emphasizing some traditions while forgetting others, creating new meanings for old symbols. This doesn't make it invalid. All tradition is invented to some degree. All cultural identity is constructed. All heritage involves selecting from the past and interpreting it for the present. The modern Welsh or Irish or Breton person, claiming Celtic identity, is doing what people have always done, finding meaning in ancestry, connecting to the past, using history to understand the present. But it does mean we must be clear-eyed about the Celtic Iron Age itself. Must try to see it as it was rather than as we wish it had been. It was not a golden age of egalitarian communities living in harmony with nature. It was a hierarchical society with significant inequality, with slavery, with warfare, with human sacrifice. The beautiful metalwork was produced for elites, by craftspeople who probably had limited control over their own labor. The hillforts and oppida required coerced labor, consolidation of power, extraction of surplus from farmers and herders. The rich burials involved enormous expenditure that could have been used to improve ordinary people's lives. But it was also impressive, a civilization that achieved urban complexity without writing, that created art of enduring beauty, that organized labor on monumental scales, that maintained trade networks spanning a continent. It was adaptive, resilient, capable of incorporating new influences while maintaining distinctive identity. It was diverse, with hundreds of tribes each expressing Celtic culture in their own way. And it was human, full of individual stories we can only glimpse, of choices made and consequences faced, of lives lived in circumstances we can barely imagine, but can still, with effort, begin to understand. The hill forts remain. Most are protected now, scheduled as ancient monuments, preserved for future generations. You can visit them, walk the ramparts, explore the interiors, imagine what they were. Some have museums nearby, displaying finds from excavations. Others are just earthworks in fields, ignored except by archaeologists and enthusiasts. But they are there, solid evidence of what was achieved, invitation to imagine what was lost. The grave goods are in museums, the torcs and mirrors, the swords and brooches, the pottery and bronze vessels, behind climate-controlled glass, carefully labelled. They wait for visitors. Most people walk past quickly, pausing perhaps at the most spectacular pieces. The Battersea shield, the Gunderstrup cauldron, the Snettisham torcs. But every object has a story, if you give it time, if you look closely at the craftsmanship, if you think about the person who made it and used it and finally deposited it, or was buried with it. The landscape holds traces. Fields that were cleared in the Iron Age, drainage systems that were first dug by Celtic engineers, roads that follow ancient routes, Much has changed. Forests that covered the land have been cleared. Rivers have been dammed and channeled. Modern development has obscured ancient patterns. But in places, especially in the uplands, the land looks much as it would have then. The same hills, the same valleys, the same basic geography. Standing in such a place, you can almost feel the continuity. Can imagine other people standing here 2,000 years ago, looking at the same view, thinking their own thoughts, living their own lives. The challenge for us now is to honor that past without romanticizing it, to learn from it without oversimplifying it, to recognize both its achievements and its limitations. The Celtic Iron Age deserves better than to be reduced to stereotypes, either noble savages living in harmony with nature, or bloodthirsty barbarians practicing human sacrifice. It was more complex than that, more interesting, more fully human. It deserves to be studied seriously, with all the tools modern scholarship can bring. Archaeology with its increasingly sophisticated techniques, linguistic analysis of the surviving languages and names, careful reading of classical sources, with attention to their biases, comparative anthropology to understand the social structures, art history to appreciate the aesthetics. The evidence is fragmentary, but there is more of it than we might think, and more is being discovered. Every excavation, every new analytical technique, every reinterpretation of old data adds to our understanding. And it deserves to be remembered, not just as prelude to Rome, not just as what came before the classical civilization that shaped Europe, but as a civilization in its own right, with its own logic, its own achievements, its own validity. The Celts built cities before Rome conquered them. They created art that still moves us. They organized complex societies, maintained extensive trade networks, developed sophisticated religious and legal systems. They were not waiting to be civilized. They had their own civilization, different from Rome's but not inferior. And they deserve to be recognized for that. The wind is still blowing across the hillfort. The sun is setting, light golden across the earthworks. Soon it will be dark, and the stars will come out, the same stars that shone on the Celtic Iron Age, on the people who built this place, who lived here, who stood where we are standing now. The sky hasn't changed. The land has changed less than we might think. What has changed is human presence, languages, technologies, social structures, the whole complex apparatus of civilization. But underneath, the continuity remains. We are still people looking at stars, still trying to understand our place in the world, still building and creating and destroying, still telling stories to make sense of it all. The Celtic Iron Age is past. Its cities are ruins, its languages changed or lost, its people long dead, their bones scattered or buried. But it is not entirely gone. It echoes still, in languages, in stories, in art, in the shape of the land, in the DNA of millions of Europeans, in the memories we choose to preserve and honor. We cannot bring it back. We would not want to, not really, not if we are honest about what life was actually like for most people then. But we can remember it, we can study it, we can let it remind us that our way of organizing the world is not the only way, that civilizations rise and fall, that what seems permanent is temporary, that change is the only constant. Standing here as darkness falls, we can acknowledge what was lost and what remains. The rampart beneath our feet, built by people whose names we will never know. The view they saw, which we see now. The stars above, which connected them to cosmos, which connect us still. The human impulse to build, to create beauty, to organize society, to seek meaning, these persist across millennia. The forms change, but the underlying drive remains. This is what the Celtic Iron Age gives us. Not models to follow, not golden age to yearn for, but evidence of human possibility, of what was achieved once, and therefore might be achieved again in different forms. It gives us perspective on our own time, reminder that our civilization too is temporary, will someday be archaeological remains for future scholars to puzzle over. It gives us humility, showing us how much can be lost, how little may survive. But it also gives us connection, placing us in a long chain of human endeavor, making us inheritors of traditions we barely understand but can still honor. The hillfort endures, the grass grows, the wind blows, and somewhere in all of this, the Celtic Iron Age persists, not as it was, that cannot be recovered, but as it lives in memory and imagination and scholarly reconstruction. This is enough. It has to be enough. The past cannot be fully known, but it can be partially recovered, carefully respected, usefully remembered. This is what we owe to those who came before, not worship, not uncritical celebration, but serious attention, honest inquiry, genuine attempt to understand. They were people like us, facing different challenges, using different tools, creating different solutions. Their story is worth telling, Their world is worth remembering, and so we tell it and remember and carry it forward into whatever future awaits.